The deity of time handed him a single deceptive trial: crush a mere cicada. For a cold-blooded young killer of his caliber, that task should have been an absolute walk in the park. But then the deity whispered, "I want to watch you suffer." Instantly, the world vanished into a pitch black. His memories, his body heat, his hearing, his smell, his vision. Entirely, the sole sensation left in the universe was his tight grip around the shaft of his spear. An ordinary mortal would have crumbled instantly, screaming for mercy. But our guy, he just hoisted his weapon and started slashing blindly into the abyss. He struck out, hitting pure emptiness, slash empty air, thrust nothingness. Enduring this agonizing loop, he relentlessly hunted a vibration his deafened ears could not even detect. When reality finally snapped back, the insect was already crushed within his palm. He had slaughtered it 3 lifetimes ago, without even realizing it. The temporal deity gazed down, declaring him the very first mortal to survive without losing his mind, and therefore he had earned the ultimate prize he spent his life hunting for. But to understand how we got here, we have to rewind back to this scrawny kid, freshly dumped into an alien dimension. A suspiciously friendly veteran is giving him the grand tour, dumping lore about the sprawling city, the leveling system, and the mysterious forces of magic. The kid just stares blankly, desperately trying to process the information overload. The veteran flashes a warm, trusting smile, offering to take the classless rookie under his wing. He even promises to buy him a thick, juicy steak, since the boy looks practically starved. The rookie casually nods his thanks and trails the veteran straight into a shady, dimly lit alleyway. There the guy hands over a totally innocent, definitely not spiked beverage. Our innocent protagonist tilts his head back to chug it, or so we thought. Instead, he violently spews the liquid right into the scammer's eyes, casually mentioning that cheap goblin paralytic venom. It might numb the tongue, but it absolutely deep fries the eyeballs. The sleazy con artist thrashes in a blind panic, shrieking and demanding to know how a fresh spawn could possibly figure that out. But our boy is already driving a brutal knee straight into the guy's groin. He snatches the concealed blade from the scammer's coat and executes him on the spot. Wiping the blood, he mutters rule number 1, trust absolutely no one in this trash-tier reality. Oh yeah, we are starting off ruthless. You see, he is actually a time regressor. In his previous life, he was nothing but a garbage C-rank grunt, fighting street dogs for scraps while praying for one massive score. One day he wandered into an ancient ruin and unearthed a mysterious relic left behind by the deity of time. That exact artifact violently ripped his soul out and tossed it back to the exact hour he first spawned in this dimension. But honestly, the rewind felt like a massive joke because he was still stuck with his original fatal flaw. He possessed 0 class, absolutely classless. And after decades of bleeding in the mud, all he ever managed to awaken was a pathetic, bottom-tier bone enhancement trait. Now listen, this is not your typical solo-leveling fantasy, where the main character becomes an unstoppable god in 5 chapters. This pale, edgy kid will eventually make entire armies shiver in fear. Plus, the female cast is extremely generously blessed, so we are eating good today. Snapping back to his reality check, the kid was fuming after realizing his physical traits were identical to his past self. He thought this second chance was a total scam, seeing his stat screen looking perfectly pathetic. However, his mind was a steel trap, holding every single secret from 13 agonizing years surviving the hellscape known as Area. Navigating the gritty streets, he stops directly outside the Healthy Bone Realignment Clinic. He knows this is step 1 in rewriting his destiny. You see, Area summoned all flavors of warriors. You had your spell-slinging mages, your bone-crushing martial artists, and then the utterly average, classless nobodies. Sure, they had the potential to learn anything, but they started off painfully weak, usually getting slaughtered long before they could adapt. That was his original fate, 13 miserable years, scraping the bottom of the barrel as a D-list mercenary, swallowing endless insults and beatings. He eventually died broke, in a ditch, forgotten by everyone. Inside the clinic, a wrinkly doctor intensely examines the boy, who demands a radical skeletal reconstruction surgery. Armed with the bitter regret of his past, Sungmin refuses to repeat his mistakes, determined to forge an unbreakable foundation. His gamble pays off instantly. He successfully secures the entry-level martial skeleton, along with the divine celestial breathing manual. Despite having empty pockets and 0 natural talent, Lee actively feels his muscles knitting tighter as he walks out the door. He just snatched the very first of 3 golden opportunities needed to bypass his doom. This modified skeleton physically rewired his anatomy, acting like an ultimate cheat code for absorbing combat techniques. He officially became patient zero for this master acupuncturist's experimental bone crafting procedure. The catch: the patient had to be totally classless, with a completely blank skill tree. His past self was disqualified instantly, purely because he had hastily locked in a garbage beginner skill. But this time his slate was clean, and considering this brilliant doctor was scheduled to drop dead very soon, almost nobody else would ever exploit this massive shortcut. To top off the massive power spike, he unlocked the authentic celestial cultivation art, an absolute masterclass in generating internal chi, the literal fuel for superhuman martial arts. Furthermore, Sungmin remembered exactly where a top-tier combat manual was collecting dust inside a rundown Genovan. The clueless shopkeeper treated it like useless junk, allowing our guy to cop the legendary scroll for mere pennies. In a single afternoon, he secured 2 of the 3 monumental power-ups he completely missed in his previous life. The final missing piece: he is going to have to survive the blood-soaked, slated to unlock 12 months down the line. He kept his hopes grounded. After all, this domain restricted entry to absolute beginners with 0 class rankings. That gave him a legitimate window to grind and level up within the walls of Genevis. But before any of that, he needed cold hard cash to secure a roof over his head. His solution? Slaughter some beasts. Inside the local shop, the exhausted merchant barely spared a glance at the scruffy kid standing at the counter. A handful of rugged mercenaries stared eagerly at the gleaming armor and weapons mounted on the walls. Stepping up, Sungmin boldly declares he wants to purchase a set. Scoffing, the merchant questions if the kid even has a dime to his name. To walk out with that gear, he would need to drop a whopping 300,000 Eries. Desperate, the boy begs for a tab, but the request crashes and burns as he gets shoved toward the exit. Yet the old merchant catches the blazing fire in the kid's eyes. Refusing to back down, Sungmin strips off his jacket, offering it up as collateral. He swears it's premium fabric, woven in a highly advanced dimension. The shop owner absolutely loses it, howling with laughter, a noise that quickly irritates the towering mercenaries browsing nearby. Wiping away tears, the merchant growls that he isn't slashing prices, just because some unranked rookie is begging. In his eyes, the punk possessed 0 shame. Surprisingly, he tosses the filthy rags back, finally agreeing to open a line of credit. Truth be told, the hardened vendor respected the kid's sheer audacity to fight tooth and nail. Brat, or not, the old man figured this stubborn survivor wasn't going to bite the dust anytime soon. Who knows, he might just become a profitable regular. Fully strapped with fresh equipment, Sungmin glares out into the pitch-black tree line. Securing that protective plating was an absolute game-changer, even if it plunged him into massive debt. Grateful for the old man's mercy, a wave of relief washes over him. This second chance was already rewriting history. Stepping into the brush, his senses dial up to maximum alert. Crossing the boundary into the treacherous hunting grounds, bitter memories flood his mind. 13 long years ago, he wandered into these exact woods as a completely stripped of armor and lacking a single combat skill. Back then, he was nothing but dead weight. Suddenly, a glowing blue interface chimes, flashing a list of newly acquired stats. Lightning step and ironclad skeleton, and the devastating destruction palm. Shadows lengthen as the sun dips below the horizon. Without warning, rustling leaves break the silence. A grotesque goblin scrambles behind a thick trunk, desperately attempting to conceal itself. But Lee Sungmin is already a step ahead, channeling the deadly soul-chasing spear art. In a single blinding blur, the steel tip shatters the monster's skull in an instant. One shot, one kill. The wretched creature didn't even have a fraction of a second to raise its guard. Catching his breath, the warrior leans against a tree, but a searing agony ripples up his arm. Glancing down at his trembling palm, the grim reality sets in. Executing that lethal thrust required intense friction from his left hand for stabilization, and his fragile, unconditioned skin was severely blistered from the sheer. Yet a cocky smirk crosses his face. He simply resolves to grind his flesh against. This timeline rewind might feel agonizingly slow, but a clean slate is a clean slate. Meanwhile, miles away in a pitch-black cavern, thick crimson smoke, a cloaked figure sits cross-legged on the damp stone, channeling raw, pulsating energy. Swirling arcane magic engulfs his entire form, As his eyes snap open, he senses a bizarre disturbance rippling. Fast forward. Sungmin pushes through the creaky doors of the rundown tavern he called home since dropping into area. The moment he steps inside, a warm, welcoming grin greets him. Jack Atrusi, the grizzled middle-aged tavern owner, leans against the counter, waiting. Without skipping a beat, Sungmin tosses his daily rent onto the wooden, pulling coins straight out of a brand-new dimensional pouch. The burly innkeeper raises an eyebrow, finding it highly suspicious for an unranked rookie to carry. Shrugging it off, Sungmin claims he snagged a killer bargain. Having seen plenty of weird phenomena in his tavern days, the old man drops the subject immediately, pivoting his attention to inspect the freshly harvested goblin fangs. Bartering the gruesome loot, Jack grants him an extra 48 hours in the room. Deep down, the veteran is absolutely blown away by the kid's relentless hustle. He recognizes a raw, undeniable spark of greatness, especially from a nobody who stumbled into Genevis completely empty-handed. 2 brutal weeks had passed. Yet the boy was not only breathing, but slaughtering beasts daily, and securing enough profit to keep a roof over his head. Jack mutters that 99% of unranked scavengers wind up dead trying to pull that off. He even wagers the kid might evolve into a legendary powerhouse, like Xenon. Brushing off the massive compliment, the young hunter spins around and trudges up the staircase, muttering about needing to crash after a grueling grind. Clicking the door shut, he slumps onto the mattress, letting Jack's heavy words echo in his mind. He knew the brutal truth. He wasn't born a prodigy. He was just insanely stubborn, dangerously desperate, and clinging to life by a thread. He intensely scans his newly logged combat arts. Despite hitting the cosmic reset button, his brain remained a vault of lethal martial arts knowledge from his previous. Sure, he could flawlessly execute those past moves from pure muscle memory, but his old arsenal was absolute garbage. No matter how many thousands of hours he dumped into those basic strikes, they would never give him the firepower to crush the true apex predators of this world. His only golden ticket was the elusive celestial cultivation art. Stripped to its core, it wasn't exactly earth-shattering, but if fused with top-tier destructive physical techniques, the synergy could elevate him to god-tier status. He makes a hard vow to skyrocket that specific cultivation manual before anything else. Dawn breaks, but just as he's throwing on his gear to step out, Lula, the tavern owner's fiery daughter, blocks the doorway. Crossing her arms, genuine panic flashes in her eyes as she demands to know why he insists on playing Russian roulette with the forest monster. She pleads with him to grab a cushy, risk-free gig in town, but Sungmin's resolve is made of titanium. Cast into this hellscape from an entirely different dimension, spilling monster blood is his only rapid path to wealth. Shaking her head, Lula calls him a total suicidal idiot, practically begging the stuff. Filled with concern, Lula pitched him a safe gig at her family tavern, since her old man already approved of him. But honestly, scrubbing floors and flipping meat just wasn't his style. She just couldn't wrap her head around why he would gamble with death over taking a cozy, secure paycheck. Lee Sungmin kept his mouth shut, his mind heavily drifting toward the grim realities of this second chance. Brushing it off, he tossed over his shoulder that he would return before sundown. Back in his previous timeline, he had clawed his way through simply by surrendering his pride, and he knew perfectly well he could play it. Not this time, though. He vowed to never crawl in the dirt again, swearing to finally snatch the absolute peak of what he truly deserved. And to reach that height, he would cross any line necessary. He craved a destiny far grander than his pathetic past. Just as he marched toward the hunting grounds, the heavy bronze bell of Genevis suddenly echoed across the afternoon sky. That hollow chime signaled only one thing. Fresh meat had just been dragged into this world. Peering into the distance, he sensed a familiar pulsing energy. There stood a young boy, right around the exact same age Sungmin had been during his very first arrival. History was brutally repeating itself. The kid looked completely lost, making him a perfect, clueless target for the local street vultures. In a flash, shady grifters were already shoving that. For a split second, a flicker of pity urged him to step in, but he quickly shoved the feeling down, deciding to mind his own business. But the moment he spun on his heel, he slammed straight into a literal wall of muscle. The guy towering over him was an absolute behemoth. Without even a single second to breathe, he found himself tangled in a classic shakedown, instantly framed for snapping the giant thug's collarbone. Snarling like a rabid dog, the brute smashed a massive fist straight into his jaw, sending Sungmin crashing into the dirt before he could utter a syllable. The brutal thud, playing the victim to manipulate the growing audience, the hulking attacker roared that the scrawny teen had shattered his shoulder, loudly, demanding an eye for an eye. Although visibly baffled, the cold-hearted locals simply shrugged and scattered like roaches. Smirking at his perfect trap, the massive punk prepared to violently snap. Seething with pure rage, Lee Sung-min suddenly connected the dots. This brute and the scammers bothering the kid were all part of the towering meathead looming over him was nothing but a trash-tier warrior, a pathetic third-rate hack who couldn't even distinguish a rib cage from a shoulder blade. In this brutal realm, fighters are strictly categorized by raw power, and third class barely counts as a decent novice. Yet frustratingly, Lee Sung-min had not even clawed his way up to that meager rank himself. Beating this mountain of flesh would require backup, but he knew damn well the cowards roaming Janavis wouldn't lift a single finger to save him. The moment it clicked that the innocent boy was about to be auctioned off into brutal slavery, he threw caution to the wind. He stepped right up, screaming at the kid to drop the poison drink. The young stranger blinked in absolute confusion, but thankfully halted the flask right before it touched his lips. Sung-min desperately prayed that this kid, the tainted liquid splashed uselessly onto the dusty cobblestones. Stepping right into Sung-min's path, the boss coiled his legs, gearing up to deliver a crushing blow, but Lee Sung-min wasn't about to go down like a helpless dog. He instantly triggered his lightning step technique, blurring the distance between him and his attack. Seamlessly transitioning, he unleashed his exoskeleton steel break, hitting the overconfident thug with a completely unexpected bone-jarring impact. In a blinding flash, his boot slammed savagely into the leader. His destruction palm and rapid-fire combos definitely hit their mark, but the burly gangster was built like an absolute tank. The brutal exchange forced both fighters to briefly jump back. Despite packing decades of hard-fought experience, his current scrawny body simply could not output the raw damage needed to topple a superior. Hyung-nim did not look threatened in the slightest. The arrogant boss confidently smirked, knowing the much smaller teenager would eventually burn through his stamina. And off to the side, a jittery lackey hissed that all this racket would definitely attract the city patrol. Eyes burning from a safe distance, the newly summoned boy observed the violent brawl with razor-sharp focus. Acknowledging that bare knuckles just would not cut it, Sung-min instinctively ripped his spear from. Out of nowhere, the mysterious kid materialized directly at his shoulder, calmly demanding that Sung-min repeat exactly what he had yelled just a few moments ago. Utterly bewildered by the bizarre timing, Sung-min grunted at the boy to hold on a damn second as he desperately braced his weapon to parry the gang leader's incoming strike. But before the blow even landed, the young boy effortlessly caught the giant's swinging fist with a mere tap. In the very next breath, a terrifying shockwave erupted from the kid, blasting Hyung-nim through the air like a rag doll. I cannot believe these lowly insects dared to treat you so rudely. The shattered bandit violently crashed directly into a groaning. That single devastating palm strike, overflowing with pure internal energy, shattered all logic. It wasn't just second class, or even first class. It was on a monstrously. A cold shiver ran down Sung-min's spine as the terrifying truth hit him. This kid standing right beside him, despite sharing the exact same age, was an abs. When the dust finally settled, Sung-min stood completely paralyzed by shock. It suddenly clicked. This seemingly innocent kid had to be the legendary Ouija Hoyon, the widely feared little celestial demon. The notorious demonic cult was an alliance of ruthless, unorthodox factions, a bloody society where absolute, overwhelming power was worshipped as the only supreme law. The absolute strongest monster ruling, that cult claims the throne as the celestial demon, and his direct heir earns the terrifying title of Young Master, which heavily implied this very boy was the fabled little celestial demon himself. Despite being exactly 13 years old, just like Sung-min, the sheer gap in their power was an uncrossable abyss. In that heart-stopping moment, Sung-min fully realized, even though Sung-min had already connected the terrifying dots, Ouija Hoyon politely introduced himself anyway. A little while later, as they settled down inside a quiet tavern room, Lee Sung-min, the chilling prodigy, then dropped a massive bombshell. Area wasn't just another continent. It was an entirely different dimension. Entirely. A realm where his almighty demonic cult. Ouija Hoyon burst into a bright laugh, genuinely amused by this absurd twist of fate, though a faint shadow of lingering anxiety flickered deep within his piercing gaze. Flashing back to the chaotic town square, the deadly prodigy suddenly tilted his head, asking exactly what Lee Sung. Failing to see why the detail even mattered now, Sungmin casually explained that he was simply trying to stop him from chugging down a highly toxic goblin. But the fierce little celestial demon absolutely despised being spoken to with such a casual buddy-buddy tone. Swallowing his pride, Lee Sungmin immediately dropped into a deep, respectful bow, rushing to apologize for. Deep inside his ego was screaming in absolute disbelief that he was actually bowing down to a 13-year-old kid. Beaming with arrogant satisfaction, Weiji Hoyeon flashed a highly amused smile, and slowly he mentioned catching a glimpse of the boy's combat skills earlier, only to ruthlessly dismiss those techniques as absolute garbage. He mocked Sungmin's fighting style as downright pathetic, demanding to know who taught him such an embarrassing routine. The regressor stared back, but instead of dragging him down further, the young prodigy dropped a bombshell. He offered to personally mentor him in the martial arts. Stunned, Sungmin simply froze in absolute silence. The little celestial demon guaranteed the boy would grow exponentially under his guidance, but he demanded exactly one catch. Heart-pounding, the regressor tensed up for a brutal A chilling bead of sweat slid down Sungmin's spine. He was entirely blindsided. Ever since he was a little kid, the heir to the infamous demon cult had secretly craved a companion. His ruthless father entirely despised the idea. Yet Hoyeon clung to an old storybook tale, claiming that true comrades could conquer any obstacle. His father fiercely argued that such bonds were strictly for pathetic commoners. The terrifying celestial demon Weiji Hui commanded that his bloodline would absolutely dominate the underworld. Stripped of any normal childhood, the young heir endured a living nightmare of endless, agonizing combat drills. His father remained incredibly heartless, punishing any trace of human empathy as a fatal flaw. In fact, during a single bloody trial, a 10-year-old Hoyeon butchered 50 grown men. Born from the ultimate villain, that horrifying massacre was practically expected. Through it all, the boy's face remained a stone-cold mask. Yet that lifelong hunger for a real bond finally sparked to life the moment he crossed paths with Lee Sungmin, a weary survivor who had traveled back in time. Burdened with crushing expectations from his very first breath, the prodigy's nightmarish training kicked off practically in the cradle. Trapped in that brutal upbringing, he never experienced a shred of normal camaraderie. But despite the incredibly bizarre situation, the unlikely duo forged an official bond of brotherhood. Hoyeon failed to mask the glowing excitement of finally having a genuine buddy. And so, the time traveler, packing the jaded soul of a 28-year-old, partnered up with a 13-year-old kid. Without wasting a second, Hoyeon started drilling Sungmin in the mystic arts of the Violet Dawn, an infamous cult discipline, famous for generating a glowing purple aura. This left the regressor utterly puzzled. He fully expected to inherit the legendary core techniques now that they were officially buddies. The tiny powerhouse quickly ordered him to drop the formal manners. The second Sungmin switched to casual slang, a massive, satisfied grin spread across the kid's face. It turned out the supreme skills were strictly locked away for the reigning leader and his successor, forcing Sungmin to master these alternative fighting styles instead. Trekking deep into the dense woods, Sungmin suddenly noticed how quickly the days had slipped away. For an entire month, the prodigy had relentlessly hammered the Purple Dawn techniques into his muscles. Now, easily shredding multiple beasts at once, his thirst for raw power only grew wilder. His actual combat tier had skyrocketed to hover between a third and second-rate martial artist, infinitely outclassing his pathetic past life. Even with those massive gains, Hoyeon's savage critiques relentlessly tore apart his mistakes, driving him to the absolute brink. While wandering the overgrown trails, Sungmin prepared to harvest his monster loot. Suddenly, a massive shadow exploded from the brush. A ferocious beast snapped right at his throat. If his reflexes had been even a split second slower, he would be a corpse. Squinting at the threat, he realized he was staring down a hulking orc. Glancing frantically left and right, the bitter truth hit him. He was totally solo and had to slaughter this giant alone. Gripping his weapon, he viciously slammed his spearhead straight into the monster's thigh. In a flash, he ripped a gaping crater through its torso, vaulted forward, and cleanly executed the brute. Catching his breath, he felt the kill was surprisingly until the young master's arrogant, nagging lectures instantly echoed in his mind. Shaking it off, he knelt down to examine the creature's bizarre features, fully aware that greenskins never roamed these specific woods. Out of nowhere, a deep voice clapped for him, praising the kid's terrifying lethal force. A seasoned veteran slowly stepped out of the shadows, It was none other than Moon Hyur-yong, the legendary fighter, widely feared as the orchid-destroying sword of the Central District. Completely clueless about the veteran's motives, Sungmin kept his guard up. Gesturing toward the bloody carcass, the swordsman explained. He was actually tracking this exact rogue beast that had been terrorizing the sector. Cutting back to the bustling city, the small monkey Du Sangryong openly doubted if this scrawny kid was cut out for the job. But the veteran quickly shot that down, swearing he had personally witnessed the boy's brutal combat skills and deemed his deadly potential incredibly fascinating. Trusting the swordsman's sharp eye, the infamous Black Rain dagger, Wang Pei, stepped up to formally introduce himself. Next, a bright-eyed spellcaster named Reiner chimed in, proudly representing the Velis Magic Academy. Leaning in with an eager spark, she asked if the rookie had any clue what kind of suicide mission they were actually tackling. A savage horde of orcs had recently constructed a fortress nearby, brutally pillaging human settlements and butchering careless mercenaries. Desperate for a fix, the local guild slapped a massive 20 million Eerie bounty to completely eradicate the stronghold. If they survived the bloodbath, the fortune would be sliced 5 ways. Crunching the numbers in his head, the boy realized his personal slice would sit at around 7 million Eerie, even with that massive bounty on the line. Paranoia still gnawed at Sungmin, but with Woon Hyur-yong staring him down, waiting for a verdict, the young spearman finally gave a tense nod. The veteran practically begged, insisting the raid would be a breeze with his spear in the mix. Sungmin took the compliment. Yet a nagging suspicion lingered in his gut. Glancing at the 2 quiet figures huddled nearby, he discovered they were nothing but living backpacks, complete classless nobodies. Hearing the new kid hailed from Murim, the porters instantly scraped the dirt in a deep bow. Their entire existence revolved around hauling gear for leftover scraps of copper. The mage tossed them a few coins, sending the duo scurrying off to fetch some fruit. Rennis casually munched on the crisp apples as the squad marched forward. Before long, the brutal stench of the orc settlement hit them. The scouting math was simple, 50 beasts total, with maybe 30 stepping up to shed blood. Dosangrian scoffed at the threat, branding the monsters as sluggish brutes. He was itching to slaughter them quickly and bag the bounty. The strategy demanded a split. Sungmin stuck like glue to the seasoned swordsman, while the secondary squad provoked the horde. Their goal: scatter the mob and butcher them, one by one. Knowing these beasts guarded their turf fiercely, Rennis whipped up a breeze to waft their human scent straight into the camp. From there they just had to vanish into the shadows, bide their time, and give the mage enough breathing room to charge her explosive magic. Meanwhile, Sungmin and Woon were tasked with sparking a flare to drag the remaining monsters out of their dens. A clean, straightforward blueprint. Sungmin admitted it was a solid tactic for a skeleton crew, even if he secretly preferred a rigged ambush. As the tree line thinned, Woon signaled they had crossed into enemy territory, warning everyone to lock in and grip their weapons tight. The vanguard pushed deep into the danger zone, trailed by the sweaty porter, groaning under the heavy luggage. Stepping onto hostile soil, the spearmen grimaced at the brutal reality of survival for these classless grunts. Staring at the exhaustion carved into the carrier's features, Sungmin saw a haunting reflection of his own pathetic past. Freezing in his tracks, he demanded the guy's name. The trembling porter whispered that he was called Brass. Knowing the upcoming bloodbath would instantly shred a weakling like him, Sungmin offered him a raw ultimatum: flee into the woods or risk his neck here. He knew Woon would not give a damn either way. But the terrified man barely registered the words, violently shaking his head as he gasped that escape would. The sheer terror of the guild's wrath for deserting a raid paralyzed him, leaving him no choice but to pray he survived the crossfire. Creeping up to the perimeter, Woon murmured that they had hit the jackpot. Dodging the hulking patrols, they spotted jagged wooden spikes piercing the forest floor. It was the perfect moment to ignite the flare, but Sungmin threw up a hand, digging frantically into his dimensional pocket. Woon stared in utter confusion. Without a word, the boy dumped out a flask of water, churning the soil to paste, and ordering everyone to slather themselves in thick. It was a gritty camouflage to mask their human stench. Coating his own arms, Sungmin muttered that his master had drilled this survival tactic into his skull. He ordered the veteran swordsman to dive into the dirt. Grudgingly, Woon dropped to his knees and complied. Sungmin even whipped up an extra batch for Brass, just seconds before sparking the crimson signal. Across the clearing, glowing eyes snapped toward the unnatural fire. Out of nowhere, the squad leader pitched a twisted idea. Toss the porter into the open as live bait. Let the beasts swarm him and ambush their blind spots. The moment those words left his Brass nearly choked on his own breath. Pure horror washed over his face, completely unconvinced by Woon's hollow promise of safety. Adding fuel to the veteran casually threatened to execute him for insubordination. He laughed it off as dark humor a second later, leaving a sickening tension in the air as they braced for impact. Sick of the games, the young spearman stepped up to draw first blood, radiating pure grit. Catching his lethal drift, the commander gave a firm nod. The gambit paid off flawlessly, yanking 13 raging monsters from the stronghold and slaughtering them in a seamless rhythm. In the heart of the chaos, Sungmin's spear danced like a deadly phantom, piercing flesh and bone with brutal precision as the green wave crashed against him. Yet amidst the spray of blood, a cynical thought echoed in his mind. Why was he even risking? Snapping back to reality, his eyes locked onto the defenseless porter. Call it foolish pity, or some twisted sense of duty, but he planted his feet to shield the man. There was no deep bond between them, just the haunting mirror of a desperate soul backed against a cliff. The remaining beasts circled him, hungering for a fatal sleep. Channeling years of hellish training, he launched himself back into the meat grinder. His master's ruthless critiques screamed in his ears, keeping his stance rock solid. Weiji Hoyan's golden rule echoed loudly. A spear is meant to dominate from a distance. Gripping the shaft, he unleashed the legendary soul-chasing spear, executing the terrifying third form, lightning split strike. The devastating aura ripped through the encroaching monsters like paper. Right at his flank, Woon Hye-young swung his blade in a frantic, bloody frenzy. But through the dust, a towering, muscle-bound behemoth charged straight for the terror, completely paralyzed and clutching empty air. The porter squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for a shattered skull. Suddenly, Sungmin's silver blade erupted through the beast's chest, stopping the execution. A faint smirk crossed the boy's face, quietly satisfied. As the dust settled, the forest floor was painted crimson, choking on. Without missing a beat, the commander whipped out his dagger, slicing off the grotesque green ears one by one. Every bloody piece of flesh meant cold, hard. Assuming the other squad handled their end of the bargain, Woon chucked his heavy sack over to Brass, barking at the porter to gather up the remaining gear. With their tasks complete, they circled back to link up with the rest of the crew. The humble porter poured out his gratitude to the boy for saving his hide, before scurrying off to pack the bags. Watching him go, the kid couldn't help but note just how raw and genuine that thank you had felt. Over at the rendezvous point, the rest of the squad was waiting for the trio's return. They were caked in thick, grimy mud, but the wave of relief washing over their faces was Phase 1 had gone off without a hitch. The captain even chimed in, bragging that they wrapped up in record time, all thanks to the young warrior's explosive skill. But the real nightmare was just waking up. Without a single warning, a dagger sliced through the air and buried itself deep into Renner's chest. Before the poor girl could even process the shock, the squad's mage violently flipped the script, unleashing her magic right at her own comrades. The surviving members instantly ripped their weapons from their scabbards. The boy whipped his spear around, cleanly parrying the sudden ambush. In that he saw a phantom of his older self, hauling a back-breaking sack of gear, just to scrape by on a few measly cops. In that memory, a massive crowd had swarmed the town square. The man on the chopping block was a ruthless mercenary, hailing from Moram. His crime, butchering every single member of his own party just to hog the bounty for himself. But karma caught up to him. The young boy remembered staring blankly at the traitor's severed head, violently spiked onto a wooden pole. Snapping back to the bloody present, that exact same monster was standing right in front of him. Caught off guard by the kid's lightning-fast reflexes, Woon Hye-young actually threw him a twisted. But the young warrior already had him entirely figured out. After all, he had literally watched this snake get his head chopped off in a previous lifetime. 13 long years had passed, but that gruesome execution was still burned into his brain. Even the captain had to admit the kid's nerves of steel were mind-blowing for his age. Having watched him slaughter those orcs, the traitorous second-rate one arrogantly sneered that the kid was still leagues beneath him. But even knowing he was walking into a brutal meat grinder, the boy flat-out refused to back down. He might have been a lower tier on paper, but the young warrior's footwork, he effortlessly predicted every incoming strike, weaponizing his spear's massive reach with razor-sharp, lethal precision. Riding the adrenaline-fueled flow of combat, he finally drew first blood. He made it crystal clear that his seasoned past and Ji Ho-yeon's brutal training had forged him into getting a front-row seat to this display of raw talent. Woon Hye-young was genuinely blown away. Still, the veteran killer banked on the kid gassing out before the fight was over. But the boy had a nasty ace stuffed up his sleeve. He had secretly laced the thick mud covering their bodies with a highly potent toxin. This specific venom didn't even need to pierce the bloodstream to do it. With that toxic sludge violently sapping away his stamina, Woon Hye-young was aggressively losing ground in a matter of seconds. Desperate to survive, the traitor violently switched up his game plan. He suddenly lunged wildly to the side, a frantic maneuver that Lee Sung-min instantly recognized as a massive red flag. With violently trembling hands, the treacherous mercenary snatched up the defenseless porter holding him hostage. He maliciously barked that he would snap the man's neck in a single heartbeat. The boy's muscles went rigid, his mind racing to shatter this deadly standoff. Woon Hye-young smirked, entirely convinced that poor Brass had become the young warrior's Achilles heel. The spearman froze for a split second, yet he adamantly refused to retreat a single inch. Taking Brass hostage was a catastrophically stupid move. He had only shielded the fragile porter because the man was a painful mirror of his own pathetic past life. And now, pure, unfiltered rage was radiating from the boy's eyes. Simultaneously, Woon felt the crippling venom shutting down his nervous system. The kid swallowed down his furious emotions, his burning exhaustion, and his creeping doubt forcing his mind into an icy calm. He knew rushing in recklessly would get them both killed. He had to conserve his explosive energy. One sloppy thrust, and he'd practically hand his life over to the enemy. But if he hesitated a second too long, he violently slammed into Woon's legs, desperately trying to shatter the mercenary's balance. The Brass latched onto the traitor with a death grip, throwing every last ounce of his body weight into the struggle. In a blind panic, the enemy viciously plunged his dagger right into the porter. As an agonizing scream ripped from Brass's lungs, a sick, victorious grin spread across the mercenary's face. But a fraction of a second later, the young warrior was already right on top of him. The treacherous snake completely lost his nerve, blubbering and begging for his pathetic life, only to be ruthlessly executed on the spot. Meanwhile, off in the distance, after an incredibly grueling bloodbath, the horrific ambush was finally over, but the victory tasted like ash. Brass hadn't survived the fatal wound. Lee Sung-min stood silently over the carnage, his blood-soaked spear protruding from the traitor's chest. Once Woon Hye-young and Wang Pei were confirmed dead, their corpses were... That meant they could officially cash in on the massive 35 million bounty. Back at the base, Woo Ji-hyun beamed with joy, seeing her warrior return in one piece, playfully demanding to know what took him so long. Completely drained of life, the protagonist collapsed face first onto his mattress, craving nothing but a brief escape from reality. Yet, the heavy guilt of Brass's gruesome murder was suffocating. If he had possessed just a fraction more speed or power, he might have dragged that innocent man out of hell. Lying there in the dark, his mind violently spiraled over the blood. He felt completely tainted by the slaughter. Out of nowhere, Woo Ji-hyun's voice sliced through the silence, point blank, asking if he had butchered a human. Her demonic senses easily picked up. Lee Sung-min calmly broke down the chaotic ambush, explaining how a second-rate scumbag tried to put him in the dirt, leaving him no choice but to fight for his life. Yet the little demon's piercing gaze didn't waver. She knew deep down he was burying something massive. The burning question gnawing at her was simple. What dark secret was he keeping? Hearing her sharp accusation, the boy slowly pushed himself off the bed. He openly confessed that he didn't even fully grasp the gravity of his own secrets, yet he could physically... He threw the question out there. Did she think it was bizarre that a total nobody like him managed to crush a second-rate martial artist? But Hye-yeon totally dodged the question. Staring right at him, she could instantly tell this guy was anything but ordinary. While Wee Ji Ho-yeon had been roaming the city streets, she spent her time trying to figure out how this brutal world actually ticked. She witnessed a lot out there, getting a grim reality check on how the bottom-tier classless survived. Most of them were absolutely miserable, scraping by on literal crumbs. For a normal person, squashing a bug is nothing, but taking down even a tiny animal requires serious guts. Throughout all their grueling training sessions, Hye-yeon had kept a hawk's eye on the boy. Literally on day one of being summoned, Sung-min plunged straight into the deadly... For him, it was a desperate fight for survival. Sure, maybe the other classless rookies couldn't pull off the same stunt, or perhaps they knew they had to, but simply lacked the nerve to gamble their lives, or take down a living, breathing creature. His friend was completely baffled. How on earth did a 14-year-old classless kid pull off all that bloodshed in a single day? After acknowledging his freakishly fast adaptation, she dropped her second suspicion. Weiji Hoyan flat out stated he was completely talentless. If she demonstrated 10 different techniques, he'd barely grasp 3 or 4 of them. Yet somehow, after just 2 short months, his spear-wielding abilities were light years ahead of a standard beginner. He completely bypassed all and his grip on internal techniques was way too refined for a total newbie. That was exactly why she found it so incredibly bizarre. A guy with 0 talent shouldn't be soaking up martial arts at this insane speed. Hoyan's razor-sharp instincts, forged through years of bitter experience, screamed that something massive was hiding behind his deadpan expression. Sungmin froze, totally unsure of how to respond, until Hoyan finally broke the tension, declaring that she absolutely despised liars. A heavy silence choked the room. Lee Sungmin fired back, saying every single person harbors secrets they desperately need to, ripping those secrets out by force. That wasn't how real friends treated each other. The kid was completely caught off guard by that logic. She simply admitted that she carried a dark secret of her own, just like anyone else. She proposed a fair trade of their hidden truths, but he instantly shot the idea down. Not backing down, she dangled an elite-tier martial art in front of him, but knowing his trash-tier talent and pathetic internal energy, he realized the technique would be totally useless. Now completely stumped, the kid scrambled for another way to crack his walls. Finally, she dropped a massive bombshell, offering him 20% of her own internal energy. The protagonist was absolutely paralyzed by the sheer weight of that offer. Deep down, this kid was just burning with intense curiosity about his hidden past. As his one and only friend, she craved to know every single piece of him. Locking eyes with him, she softly confessed that this level of trust was what true friendship actually meant. Slumped on the edge of the bed, Sungmin demanded an ironclad promise from Hoyan. If he spilled the raw truth, she couldn't strike him down. But Weiji Hoyan firmly promised she could never bring herself to murder her own friend. Unbinding her hair and letting it cascade down, she dropped her own bombshell. She was actually a girl. The protagonist's jaw practically hit the floor. She revealed how her fiercely protective father had forcing her to live a double life as a boy just to walk her chosen path. The magnitude of this confession left Sungmin completely speechless. Even after being dragged into this twisted world, she clung to the disguise simply because it had been her reality for so long. This was the ultimate secret she had buried away from the entire world, and now she was handing that trust over to him. Processing the shock, Sungmin awkwardly pointed out they were with the thick tension still hanging in the air, he knew he had to lay his own cards on the table. Scraping together every ounce of his courage, he took a massive shaking breath and confessed that he was a regressor. Weiji Hoyan's eyes blew wide open, though she was clearly clueless about what that word even meant. He broke it down for her. He had literally died, rewound the clock, and dragged all the brutal memories of his past life back with him. Suddenly, his unnervingly polished skills made perfect sense, even if the whole time travel concept sounded like absolute fiction. Then again, in a chaotic nightmare world like this, pretty much anything was on the table. Tilting her head in pure confusion, the girl asked why on earth she would ever want to murder him over something like that. Sure, physically he looked like a 14-year-old kid, but his mind belonged to a grizzled 27-year-old man. He still felt a massive wave of guilt for faking his age, his identity, and his entire history. But to Hoyan, absolutely none of that garbage mattered. She was the one who initially walked up to him, pushed him to master martial arts, and he hadn't manipulated her at all. He merely embraced the hand she extended. Therefore, she didn't have a single reason to end his life or their powerful friendship. Over those intense 2 months, she had grown to see him as a true ride-or-die companion. And one little time travel secret wasn't about to shatter that bond. In her eyes, that unconditional acceptance was the core of friendship. Her tough exterior melted into a warm, emotional smile as she thanked him for trust. Their connection had officially become unbreakable, forged in the fires of mutual trust and respect. But of course she couldn't resist throwing a playful jab at. She joked that even with a whole second life under his belt, his current power level was still totally pathetic. She had a mountain of burning questions, but those could take a back seat for tonight. Right now she was locked in and ready to channel her precious internal energy straight into him. The protagonist sat there completely floored, realizing she wasn't bluffing at all. Internal energy was the absolute lifeblood martial artists stockpiled inside their own cores. It was the sole fuel that allowed them to pull off mind-bending superhuman miracles. And in this brutal world, there were zero cheat. True strength demanded relentless cultivation. That was the harsh reality, driving warriors to dedicate their entire existence to the grind. The moment Hoyon channeled her ki, she felt the resistance. His internal pathways were a total mess, choked tight with years of toxic buildup. She didn't hold back, though. Pushing through the blockage, she banked on him absorbing a fraction of the surge. If he just anchored himself with the Violet Dawn arts, he could salvage a solid 20%. Slapping her palm against his spine, she flooded his system. Sungmin gritted his teeth, feeling a molten current rip through his core. Drained but grinning, Hoyon wiped the sweat from her brow. "So," she teased softly, "how's the rush?" He couldn't even speak. The sheer blistering heat, that mere 20% dwarfed his entire lifetime of progress from his past. He locked down half of that raw power, and the evolution began immediately. The leftover ki pooled deep within his pathways. All he needed was relentless practice with the Violet Dawn arts to forge that feral energy into a... Exhausted, Hoyon crashed onto the mattress. Watching her breathe, Sungmin wrestled with a heavy thought. Why go to such extreme lengths for him? When he finally whispered the question, Weiji Hoyon flashed a warm, effortless smile. Because we're friends, obviously. Every drop of sweat she shed for him wasn't born from obligation. It was entirely her call. Sinking into the pillows, a deep sense of pride washed over her. But she wasn't done yet. She had one final, lethal trick to pass down. The legendary Supreme Spear of the Nine Heavens. The signature earth-shattering art of the Spear King himself. She knew exactly how far behind Sungmin started. Yet, she was ready to pour her soul into hammering that elite technique into his... Her excuse remained the same. She was just having fun. But the truth ran deeper. He was the first genuine connection she had forged in 13 lonely years. The thought of him dying another pathetic, meaningless death terrified her. Her fierce loyalty hit Sungmin right in the chest. Cupping his cheeks, she locked eyes with him, ordering him to never bow down to a friend. Tracing the nasty bruise on his jaw, she scoffed, still blown away that someone actually managed to clock him. She yanked him in close. A playful spark lit up her eyes as she demanded juicier stories from his previous life. Trading secrets in the quiet room welded their bond tighter than steel. Her curiosity piqued. What kind of monster was she in his original timeline? Sungmin shook his head. He only knew the terrifying campfire tales that she sat unchallenged at the absolute apex of area. In that timeline, she ditched the starting city within weeks of her summoning, completely vanishing off the grid for 3 massive years. Leaning back, she chuckled at the idea. She figured her future self must have been roaming the wild. After all, true freedom was all she ever... Back in the cult, her so-called liberty was tightly leashed by the leader, getting dragged into this dimension. It was the greatest thing that ever happened to her, not just for the escape, but for finally finding a real friend. The atmosphere shifted as she dropped a bombshell she was packing up and leaving in exactly 1 month. The open road was calling her name. Once she drilled that final, godly spear technique into his brain, she was hitting the trails just like her past self did. But right now, the spotlight was on him. What was his next? She probed into his ultimate endgame. The heavy question left him completely stunned, scrambling for words. Flashes of his miserable, blood-soaked past flooded his mind. He was certain of only one fact. He refused to die a loser again. He just craved a decent, honorable life. Hoyon rolled her eyes at the weak response. She was dead set on cracking open the true burning ambition hiding inside Lee Sungmin. Burying his face in the sheets, he confessed he was clueless. Smiling, she promised to hold him to it until he found his real purpose. The interrogation continued. She wanted every gritty detail of his former days. Blushing hard, Sungmin mumbled that his old life was pitifully boring. But as the words left his mouth, reality struck him like a punch. Across 2 lifetimes, he had never made a single genuine connection. Hoyon was literally his first. That quiet night blurred into weeks, and just like that, their 30 days were up. But before she walked out the door, she needed to see the monster she had built. This was the final clash, the ultimate graduation test. He had to lay all his cards on the table. It was time to unleash the beast. Across the dirt, Hoyon flashed a cocky grin, fully aware he still couldn't lay a scratch on her. Sungmin leveled his blade, his gaze turning deadly cold. Then she threw a massive curveball, granting him 20 free shots. The sheer disrespect instantly put him on high alert. He froze, calculating the perfect opener. His mind flashed to the custom-tailored masterpiece she had forged specifically for his hands. She had literally branded the technique with his name. That hit him harder than any martial arts epiphany. It was solid proof that he finally mattered to someone. A terrifying hybrid, fusing the explosive Nine Heavens stance with the lethal venom of the soul-chasing style. Built entirely around his unique rhythm, the showdown ignited. Gripping the shaft, he exploded forward, unleashing his brand-new arsenal. He chained it seamlessly into a vicious soul-chasing thrust. Hoyan didn't even blink. With a ghost-like pivot, she effortlessly let the blade whistle past her. But he didn't stop. He pushed the tempo, striking harder, cutting sharper. His focus dialed to absolute. Shifting his weight, he triggered his second form, the crackling, lightning-splitting pursuit. The amateur who used to fumble his weapon was dead. Now he was a tactician, mastering raw momentum, parrying deadly blows, and choking out his opponent with suffocating pressure. He even weaponized micro-movements, delivering surgical jabs designed to shatter airtight defenses. Sure, these spear techniques were rudimentary, but he carved them out through sheer willpower alone. Yet if he ever wanted true mastery, he'd have to grind, day in and day out. Clashing with Hoyan put that evolution on full display. Even then, an invisible wall kept him from tapping into his maximum potential. Biting back his frustration, he channeled raw, explosive ki into every single thrust, exactly as she instructed. A proud smirk crept onto Hoyan's face seeing his progress. Even though her guidance had pushed him straight into the second-rate realm, she effortlessly parried his onslaught with nothing but her right hand. This was the aura of a bona fide grandmaster. While he gasped for air and threw everything he had, she remained as calm as a gentle breeze, shutting down his. Refusing to quit, he lunged forward again. Slash after slash, stab after stab. She swatted them away like mere flies. 19 blistering strikes, all neutralized by that single, unwavering palm. As his final thrust deflected off into the air, the bitter taste of defeat washed over him. Wait. A final desperate gambit caught her slipping, bringing the lethal steel just inches from her cheek. A triumphant grin flashed across his face, but in the blink of an eye she dissolved into thin air. Checkmate. She materialized right at his back, cementing his utter loss. Yet instead of mocking him, Hoyan showered him with praise, finally acknowledging housing that much potent inner ki meant Sungmin was practically built for the martial path. Hell, without even realizing it, his instincts had already locked onto her terrifying presence before she moved. That was a sensory feat usually reserved for absolute prodigies. She poured so much faith into his abilities, boldly declaring that his spearmanship would one day shake the heavens. Her words carried the weight of someone peering a decade into the future. Sure, sweeping the floor with him took zero effort on her part, but genuine joy radiated from her smile anyway. He had completely shattered her initial expectations. Then she dropped a bombshell. They would reunite in exactly 10 years. Just 30 days prior, she had pressed him about his ultimate life ambition, leaving him utterly speechless. So she offered herself as the target. A warrior without a purpose is just a drifter, waiting to die. Her ultimatum was crystal clear. Survive for 10 years. Crawl your way up and come back strong enough to crush. Sungmin froze, self-doubt immediately poisoning his thoughts. He argued he was a talentless nobody, miles away from a freakish genius like her, who grew up chugging mythical elixirs. Their starting lines weren't even in the same universe. That suffocating inferiority complex from his previous miserable life was wrapping its icy fingers around his throat once more. Hoyan didn't hide her disgust. She scowled, visibly irritated by. She despised that pathetic self-pity, and her biting insults finally sparked a raging fire in his eyes. He barked back that he was dumped into area with absolutely zero advantages. No innate talent, no wealthy backers, just a desperate kid wrestling wild boars in the bloody mud, scraping by like street trash until he met a Hoyan instantly shot back, reminding him that he had just absorbed legendary mystic arts and skyrocketed to a second-rate martial artist in a mere 90 days. The universe handed him a miraculous do-over, yet he still cowardly refused to aim for the stars. She desperately hammered reality into his thick skull, but suddenly Hoyan stepped back, catching the raw, unadulterated fury boiling over in his expression. Sungmin was practically pulling his hair out. How the hell was a 7-year-old child giving him a savage reality? Taking a deep breath, he swallowed his pride, accepted the insane gauntlet, and locked her in as his ultimate milestone. But then he awkwardly promised to drive a spear straight through her heart, which instantly terrified Hoyon. That was definitely buddies don't murder each other. Once the fiery tension dissolved, he realized how psycho that sounded, and furiously blushed in humiliation. Seizing the opportunity, Hoyon mercilessly poked fun at him, leaving the poor guy a flustered, annoyed mess. The ironclad pact was sealed, 10 years until their next clash. Flashing a mischievous grin, she purred that she couldn't wait to taste his spear. Sungmin choked on his spit. That phrasing sounded ridiculously sketchy. Even as a literal child, she thrived on tormenting him. Sure, there was a massive age gap between them, but she weaponized it for laughs anyway. Stepping dangerously close, she boxed him in and boldly proclaimed that in a decade, she'd be a fully blossomed woman. So he wouldn't have a single excuse to complain then. Calming down, Sungmin carved 3 absolute directives into his mind. First, survive. Second, exploit every single cheat code. As Hoyon slung her travel bundle over her shoulder, they finally exchanged their bittersweet goodbyes. He swore on his life that they would cross paths when the 10-year mark hit. He was genuinely counting down the days, which brought him to his third most crucial objective, absolutely refusing to die before cashing in on that promise. Looking her dead in the eye, he vowed to stay breathing. For the first time ever, he actually had a burning purpose and someone worth fighting for. With that, the 2 unlikely comrades turned their backs and walked into their set. During his brutal stint in Janavis, Lee Sungmin secured 3 monumental treasures: the reconstructed martial skeleton, the legendary true celestial cultivation technique, and finally, the infamous tournament of the Classless, an underground blood sport exclusively for unawakened nobodies. Exactly 10 months after Hoyon vanished from his life, Janavis hosted the brutal gauntlet once more. By this point, Sungmin had clawed his way into the first-rate martial tier, turning the so-called fierce competition into a total cakewalk. His grand prize, a hyper-rare secret, a potion designed to massively supercharge a warrior's inner ki. He chugged the fiery liquid on the spot, though honestly, next to the mythical stuff Hoyon, it felt like drinking a cheap energy drink. Still with that final power-up absorbed, Sungmin knew he had squeezed every last drop of value out of it. Was time to pack up and get the hell out of Dodge. Making his way toward the city gates, he bumped into his old acquaintance Hans, the street peddler. Hans beamed, throwing congratulations his way, before launching into his usual sales pitch. But the cheerful banter quickly shifted into a heavy farewell once Sungmin dropped the news of his departure. The vendor gave a knowing, bittersweet smile. His eyes swelled with a mix of fatherly pride and mild sorrow, having watched this scrappy kid hustle from deep down. Hans firmly believed this rugged, classless underdog was going to tear up the world outside those walls and survive whatever hell. Before Sungmin could take another step, Hans tossed him a parting gift. A slightly worn, second-hand dimensional pouch, packing 50% more inventory space than his busted old one. Sungmin stared in disbelief. Why would Hans give away such a priceless item? Hans simply waved it off, insisting that free things should be taken without question. Besides, the battered pouch wouldn't fetch a single coin at the market. It was a parting present. Once Sungmin carved his name into the world, he could pay the vendor back 100-fold. The humble merchant only asked for one thing in return. He wanted the boy to never forget the lowly stall owner who gave him a push when his journey. Bowing his head in deep gratitude, Sungmin offered a final thank you and turned away. He retraced his steps back to the familiar tavern he called home. But before he could slip away, Lula, the tavern keeper's daughter, blocked his path. One glance was all she needed to piece together his departure. The painfully spotless quarters gave it away immediately. Pouting, she reminded him that scrubbing the floors was strictly her duty. A wave of warmth washed over Sungmin as he reflected on his peaceful days under their roof. Lula understood the harsh truth. Travelers like him never anchored themselves to this town forever. Drifters always vanished eventually, and she had grown numb to the cycle. Yet hearing him say the actual words shattered her tough exterior, leaving a heart. The sudden reality of his exit was too much to swallow. Panic and sorrow clashed in her chest. Before he could take another step, she screamed out a bitter curse, wishing for him to meet in some forgotten wasteland. Spinning on her heel, she stormed down the hall in a fiery rage. Jack, watching the entire dramatic explosion unfold, could only scratch his head at the baffling complexities of the female mind. He offered a weary sigh and a quick apology, blaming her fiery temper on foolish youth. Brushing off the insult with a gentle smile, Sun Min revealed the quiet wisdom of an old soul trapped in a young body. Seeing this, the burly tavern owner handed over a faded mantle from his glory days. Woven with warming spells and blade-enhancing enchantments, the rugged fabric hid incredible power beneath its modest exterior. Sun Min accepted the heavy garment with immense gratitude. Laughing Jack advised him to visit a tailor, as the massive cloth swallowed the boy whole. His rough voice softened as he called Sun Min the finest unmarked traveler to ever cross his threshold. Blinking away heavy tears, Jack choked out a final plea for the boy to survive the brutal world. Pulling the oversized fabric tightly around his shoulders, Sun Min stepped. His boots ground to a sudden halt. Frantic footsteps echoed on the cobblestone behind him. Just as he crossed the threshold, Lula's desperate voice shattered the noise. He spun around to find her hunched over, gasping wildly for air. Her lungs burned from the mad dash. Waiting a tense second to catch her breath, she hung her head in shame, furiously retracting every hateful syllable she had spat in the lobby. Heavy beads of sweat rolled down her as she confessed her true desire. She begged him to survive, to live an impossibly long life. Sun Min's eyes widened. He couldn't believe she had chased him down the street just to pour her heart out. With trembling lips, she prayed for his safety, demanding that if the cruel world ever broke his spirit, he must drag himself back to this very town. A soft, genuine smile, deeply moved by her clumsy but pure affect. Blushing furiously, she finally admitted the truth. Somewhere between his arrival and departure, her view of him had shifted. The unfamiliar flutter in her chest confused her, but she realized she had fallen for the quiet drifter. Her brave confession hung heavily in the air. A profound silence stretched between them, finally broken that he had sensed it all along. Terrified that the wilderness would claim his life, she trembled. He softly ordered her to wipe away her worries. They exchanged their final farewells, but the crushing weight of reality finally snapped her control. Lula collapsed into a sobbing mess. In his previous miserable existence, Sun Min had burned 3 grueling years just to scrape through Genos. This time, he dominated the region in a single year. In his past life, he dragged himself out of this place with nothing but scars and regrets. Now his mind brimmed with precious moments he swore to protect. Throwing one final glance over his shoulder, he questioned if his boots would ever touch the soil of Area again. Burying the thought, he marched toward the horizon, clutching tightly to his promise of survival. Lee Sun Min arrived at the ominous peaks of Mount Mush at a staggeringly young age. To push forward, he had to embrace a brutal restriction. Survival demanded absolute endurance. His mind drifted back to Wee Ji Hoi Yun. He remembered her asking to set a reunion point, completely lost when it came to navigating this alien world. Needing a massive, unmissable landmark, he locked in Behenger. 9 long years still separated them from that fated reunion, but a burning question haunted his present steps. What was his first move? Sprinting blindly toward Behenger made 0 sense. The thought of hoisting a sword for coin crossed his mind. But plunging back into the mercenary underworld was just a replay of his pathetic past. He refused to walk that doomed trail a second time. He desperately needed a crucible to forge his strength. That hunger led him straight to Mount Mush, the sacred domain ruled by Area's god of suffering and agonizing trials. Legends whispered that bleeding on these slopes multiplied a warrior's growth by hundreds. Plus, the towering peak was right in his backyard. The decision was instant. Scaling the treacherous trails, he threw himself into hellish training, locked under the crushing curses bestowed by a local priest. He accepted 2 brutal vows. The first curse manipulated gravity itself. His bones, his rags, and every single scrap in his pack suddenly weighed a ton. A simple loaf of bread dragged his arms down like a block of solid iron. But the second trial was pure psychological torture. The second his teeth pierced his stomach violently rebelled. A repulsive flavor exploded across his tongue, forcing him to vomit violently onto the dirt. This was his second agonizing restriction. The divine magic warped his taste buds into a living nightmare. His palate wasn't numb or deadened. Far worse, every bite transformed into pure rot. The horrific curse didn't stop at flavor. It twisted the texture, making a simple meal feel exactly like crunching down on a fat, squirming cockroach. A cold shiver of panic gripped his spine. Starvation and dehydration suddenly felt like a very real threat. For a fleeting, desperate second, did he really need to torture himself like this? He could easily abandon the mountain march to Behanger and carve out a decent living swinging a blade. Smashing through the B-rank barrier would be a breeze. That alone was a paradise compared to his miserable first life. Yet the striking image of Weiji Hoyan refused to leave his mind. Fueled by her memory, he snatched up the cursed bread and shoved it past his lips. Pure gag-inducing filth coated his mouth, but he furiously chewed and swallowed. Screaming mental curses at Mush for designing such a twisted game, he swallowed his disgust and embraced the suffering. High above the agony, a divine whisper drifted through the wind, the goddess amusedly labeling him a sudden surge of raw energy jolted through his veins. He whipped around, scanning the empty woods, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. 7 agonizing days crawled by. The brutal elements battered him relentlessly, yet he pushed on, stalking the brush until he locked eyes with a lone deer. Gripping his ring tight, he melted into the shadows, biding his time before launching his ambush. But as he closed the distance, the creature's innocent gaze completely paralyzed his killing intent. He stood there frozen in hesitation, watching his meal dart into the thicket. Lee Sung-min's brutal mountain trial was slowly crushing his spirit, leaving him wondering just how much more torment he could endure. Utterly drained, he dropped his spear and stared blankly ahead, questioning his life choices. Starving and stripped of proper nourishment, he was barely clinging to life on nothing but stale bread and water. This unforgiving peak demanded absolute self-reliance. He had to scavenge for his own meals, craft his own clothes, and build his own shelter, all while suffocating. The climate violently swung between freezing cold and scorching heat, while the local beasts prowled with terrifying speed and monstrous strength. His crushing physical burden made hunting an absolute nightmare, and even when he scored a kill, his vanished sense of taste turned every bite into ash. Despite this hell, he planned to endure this torture, yet barely 7 days in he was already teetering on the edge of collapse. Lost in his bleak thoughts, the sudden chilling presence of a stranger snapped him back to reality. A mysterious woman stepped out of the wilderness. He had never laid eyes on her before, his mind racing to figure out her identity. Thankfully, an absolute law governed this mountain, strictly forbidding martial artists from shedding each other's blood. He exhaled slowly, realizing he might actually be safe. However, this enigmatic stranger suffered a curse of her own. It didn't take long for Lee Sung-min to piece it together. She was bearing the brutal penalty of silence. Suddenly, the very same deer he had let slip away was tossed at his feet stone dead. Grabbing a nearby branch, the silent stranger began carving words into the dirt, using Arya's common tongue. She revealed she had been tracking his pathetic struggles for days, knowing full well he was practically begging for a Grim Reaper's visit if she didn't step in to save him. Relieved but deeply paranoid, he narrowed his eyes and demanded to know her price. Her answer was simple. She wanted absolutely nothing, offering her aid out of pure kindness. This bizarre savior completely took him under her wing, providing everything he needed. She playfully dubbed herself nothing more than a passing good Samaritan. Every single time danger reared its ugly head, she swooped in like a guardian angel. Finally, he asked for her actual name, and her written reply left him absolute. She was none other than Baek Sogo, a legendary icon from his previous life. Revered across the realms as Baek Sogo, the Lightning, her blinding speed was the stuff of absolute myth. But crossing paths with a future titan wasn't what made his blood run cold. He carried a dark secret, he knew, that exactly 8 years from now, she was destined to be slaughtered by the terrifying little celestial demon Weiji Hoyan. Here on Mount Mush, martial artists were slapped with fresh, agonizing curses every 6 months, bound by the strict rule against killing one another. Lee Sung-min racked his brain desperately, trying to piece together how such an unstoppable force like Baek Sogo could ever meet her demise, wondering if she perished in some deadly Right beside him, the silent warrior studied his face intently. He practically jumped out of his skin when she abruptly shifted her weight. Dragging her slender fingers across a flat stone, she sketched out a quick message, genuinely concerned that he was already starving again. Despite her awe-inspiring martial prowess, her cruel curse completely sealed off her telepathic sound transmission. But as he scrutinized her movements, a chilling realization: after surviving this hellish peak for 18 grueling months, her latest penalty had completely severed all sensation in her left arm, leaving it utterly deadened. Just like him, she was surviving under crippling chains. Yet Baek Sogo looked at him with deep pity, heartbroken that he was robbed of the simple joy of tasting a warm meal. Burning with curiosity, he asked what horrific penalties the other survivors were enduring. Taking the hint, she decided it was time to drag him along and introduce him to the remaining veteran, who had survived this torturous training ground for over 6 months. Before he could even blink, Bek Sogo vanished from his sight like a crack of blinding lightning. Jaw-dropping in shock, he marveled at how anyone could possibly rival that godlike velocity. Even if he wasn't chained down by his crushing weight curse, his sluggish body couldn't dream of moving that fast. The harsh reality slapped him in the face. He desperately needed to level up his footwork. Eager to learn, he boldly asked if she could take him on as her student, only to immediately backtrack with an awkward chuckle, claiming it was just a bad joke. Instead of laughing, she effortlessly hoisted him up with a single arm. Deciding he was way too pathetic to keep up, she simply strapped him to her back like a sack of potatoes. Whoa, hold up a sec, he panicked, desperate to process the situation, but she completely ignored his frantic pleas and blasted off into the forest. The moment they crashed into the survivor camp, a gut-wrenching foul stench assaulted his nostrils. It was coming from Scarlet, a legendary future Grand Mage, whose sickening curse strictly forbade her from ever bathing or changing her filthy rags. Then there was Doc Baejun, the man fated to become the infamous Phantom Sword, whose curse had completely hollowed out his vision, leaving him utterly blind. As for Bek Sogo, she was enduring the agonizing loss of her left eye. A chill ran down Lee Sungmin's spine as he realized he was standing right in the middle of absolute legends. Titans he only... These unpolished diamonds were destined to become unstoppable forces across area, but right now, they were just nameless nobodies. Breaking the ice, Scarlet bluntly demanded to know what kind of curses he was hauling. When he casually confessed he kicked off his hellish trial with 2 brutal penalties, she scoffed in sheer disbelief, openly placing bets on how fast he'd break. The blind swordsman Doc Baejun chimed in calmly, stating that for a madman craving absolute power on Mount Mush, stacking 2 curses on day 1, the seasoned warrior saw the burning hunger in the kid's eyes, knowing he was willing to obliterate his own limits at any bloody cost. Lee Sungmin nodded fiercely at every single word, a dark resolve radiating from him that sent an... Doc Baejun gravely explained that while a flood of eager challengers constantly swarmed this cursed peak, only 4 absolute monsters had managed to survive the last 6 months. Flashing a knowing grin, the blind man promised he'd be closely monitoring the kid's chaotic journey. He then dropped a massive bombshell the legendary Bek Sogo herself had also kicked off. After wrapping up the introductions, the group headed back. But her earlier words lingered. Only 4 martial artists had survived this grueling peak for over 18 months, which meant a 5th person was lurking around, a guy named Flam. Just hearing that name made the others tense up. Old man Doc Baejun had given a strict warning. Keep the kid far away from Flam. The guy was pure danger. Sungmin could not wrap his head around why everyone dreaded this lone straggler, but he brushed it off. The days blurred together, and after 4 grueling months of literal hell, his power had surged. The mountain's curses clamped down harder, stacking invisible boulders on his shoulders and turning every bite of food to ash in his mouth. Yet his growth was undeniable. By the end of those 4 months, his violet dawn aura ignited, breaking right through to the 3rd star level. Every thrust of his blade grew razor-sharp and devastatingly heavy. Mount Mush was a nightmare, but the payoff was absolute. Under the blazing sun, he relentlessly drilled the supreme ring of the 9 heavens spear art. Under the moonlight, he meditated, circulating his violet dawn energy. He swallowed the agony, treating it like a faithful companion. Even when his bones screamed and threatened to shatter, he embraced the brutal destiny he had carved out. His muscles coiled and expanded with raw power, ripping against the seams of his tight clothes. Then out of nowhere he spotted a fresh face, a kid, looking to be exactly his age, staring him down with an amused, piercing gaze. The stranger looked genuinely entertained by the ferocious spear forms he had just witnessed. Leaning casually nearby, the newcomer smirked, saying he had never stumbled across another teenager wandering this hellish peak. He flashed a smile and dropped his name, Flam, the exact phantom everyone was terrified of. Tilting his head, Flam casually asked for the name of the boy swinging that lethal weapon. Meanwhile, miles away, Scarlet sat cross-legged, weaving intricate spells, her mind drifting to the terrifying reality of absolute. The old master had once warned them. Flam's innate talent was so monstrous, so suffocating, that he practically chuckled while looking down at the rest of humanity. That was the exact reason they told Sungmin to avoid him at all costs. Just standing in his shadow was enough to drag a normal person into bottom. The old man's dire warning echoed in his skull as he stiffened nervously, whispering, "I am Lee Sung-min." Flam's grin widened, instantly catching on that his dark reputation had preceded him. Trying to break the tension, Sung-min quickly turned his back, grumbling that he had to get back to his spear drill, not waste time gossiping. Deep down, Sung-min was practically scoffing. Was this cocky kid really the ultimate prodigy? Thinking the freak was finally leaving, Sung-min resolved to ignore the distraction. But the arrogant brat refused to back off, trailing right behind him, firing off endless annoying questions. Frustrated, Sung-min snapped that he was going back to practice, only to realize his hands were completely empty. His spear had... He whipped around. Flam was casually twirling the heavy weapon, openly baiting him. The twisted, psychopathic smirk plastered on the kid's face sent chills down it. In the martial world, letting an enemy strip your weapon is the ultimate humiliation. Yet before the boiling rage could even set in, Sung-min was just utterly bewildered. Flam lazily shrugged, tossing out a remark about borrowing it for a quick second. Without missing a beat, he dropped into a stance and perfectly mirrored Sung-min's. Wielding the supreme balance of the 9 heavens, the boy unleashed a brutal strike, a complex move he had memorized flawlessly just by watching. It was the exact lightning-fast sequence Sung-min had used to slice through a massive tree trunk. Right before his eyes, Flam ruthlessly replicated the lethal art that Sung-min had bled for months to master. Whistling at the sheer destruction he just caused, the prodigy casually praised the technique's power. Sung-min stood paralyzed. His blood ran cold. This monster had flawlessly with a single glance. Flam just threw his head back and laughed, utterly delighted, to rub his overwhelming superiority in the ordinary boy's face. Humiliation scorched through Sung-min's veins like acid. Meanwhile, Flam sighed, genuinely baffled as to why pathetic weaklings tortured themselves on this peak, especially when he could crush them without breaking a sweat. Shaking his head, the boy muttered that none of these so-called experts even came close to his level. Utterly thrown off, Sung-min Flam scoffed, calling powerhouses like Baek Sogo Scarlet, and the old master nothing but total freaks. He proudly bragged that he could rip off any warrior's ultimate moves on sight. Hell, even the kid himself didn't know why he was blessed with such an absurd cheat code. In Sung-min's eyes, this arrogant prodigy blazed like a blinding sun, completely out of reach. How in the world could a talentless grunt ever hope to stand on the same stage as these freaks of nature? It was a harsh slap in the face compared to Hoi-Yan. She was brilliant, sure, but she never threw her genius in his face, hiding her godlike potential behind a humble, everyday smile. Changing the subject, Flam boldly demanded to know what curse the mountain had slapped on him, casually flexing that he was carrying. He even burst out laughing openly, trashing the curse of humility, which forced Sung-min to physically take a step back from the psycho. Bored with his toy, but Sung-min completely ignored it. He was utterly sick of this guy. A suffocating wave of fury, sheer embarrassment, and crushing powerlessness swallowed him whole. The prodigy blinked, totally oblivious to the venom in Sung-min's eyes. He even had the nerve to suggest the weakling should just pack up and flee the mountain, tossing out a cruel remark that the kid had already hit his pathetic limit. Now drawing blood on this sacred ground was a massive taboo. Yet as Sung-min blindly lunged forward, Flam didn't even flinch. He just laughed. He sneered, calling out the bluff, claiming the loser only dared to swing his fists because the guaranteed absolutely no one would actually die here. Right at that explosive moment, Baek Sogo faded from the shadows, silently watching throwing his hands up in mock surrender, whining that he was just taking the rusty old spear for a friendly spin. And honestly, Sung-min was blowing things entirely out of proportion. Flam had praised the spear technique as an absolute masterpiece, but bluntly added that our hero completely lacked the raw talent to wield it. The more god-tier the martial art, the more impossibly... That meant Sung-min faced an agonizingly long road ahead. Up on this brutal mountain, suffering was currency. The harsher the restriction, the heavier the blessing Goddess Mush bestowed. Flam's advice was incredibly dangerous. If you want to skyrocket your growth, you have to drag yourself straight to the absolute brink. But before he could spill another word, his own divine gag order clamped his mouth shut. Standing right behind him, Baek Sogo watched, genuinely blown away by his sheer audacity. The damage, however, was already done. Sung-min's mind was instantly made up. Surging with desperate resolve, he sprinted straight toward the temple. Baek Sogo panicked, frantically trying to scream his name, but her own restriction violently choked her words. That heavy word, talent, echoed relentlessly in her skull, completely shattering her own pride. Meanwhile, the desperate young man screamed out for Goddess Mush. His crippling inferiority complex was swallowing him alive, mutating from bitter frustration into bottomless despair. Answering his desperate plea, the goddess materialized right before the mortal who summoned her. White-knuckling his spear, he boldly demanded yet another brutal restriction. Suddenly reality warped, throwing Lee Sung-min. The ethereal entity he summoned floated right in front of him. This was Mush, the absolute goddess of prohibitions. He was standing right inside her sanctuary. He cautiously asked if she was the real deal, and she confirmed it. The deity had actually answered his desperate cry. Tilting her head in sheer curiosity, she asked if he seriously wanted to chain himself down even more. He already suffered under the loss of taste and a crush, two utterly agonizing burdens. Yet he braced himself to shoulder a third. Mush stared at him, deeply, skeptical of his insane death wish. After all, his soul was heavily branded with the scent of a time traveler, a regressor, and a deity can easily read the tangled threads of a mortal's destiny. Every living creature is doomed to perish, and cheating that universal law violently twists the very fabric of fate. Only the absolute anomalies, who shatter their pre-written destiny. He was absolutely nothing like them. Yet somehow, he had still shattered cause and effect, clawing his way back to the past after taking his last. Every single life is chained to cause and effect. Dodging the Grim Reaper was a massive crime against nature, and his soul was doomed to pay a catastrophic karmic debt. He would walk away clean while he was alive, but the second he died, he would be tortured for millions of hours. That was the horrifying price tag for cheating the universe. But our hero didn't look even remotely fazed by the threat of hell. Back in reality, Baek Sogo was staring at him, absolutely shattered by his reckless stunt. It instantly clicked for her. He had actually taken on a third handicap, even with two nightmarish curses already crushing him. Shivering violently, he realized he was terrifying her. Her eyes went wide at his next words, and she nervously choked out a question, demanding to know exactly what he had sacrificed this time. He calmly confessed that he was now cursed with the prohibitions of heat and dreams. Sacrificing your senses and tampering with the abstract were the most lethal limits of all. The first curse instantly sucked every ounce of warmth right out of his bones. Blazing fires and scorching sunlight would never warm him again. The second curse hijacked his sleep, trapping him in an endless loop of his most agonizing, traumatic memories. The tragic loss of his parents, his suffocating childhood terrors, the crippling anxiety, every single ounce of his trauma. Sleep was no longer a sanctuary, but a torture chamber. Baek Sogo stared in pure horror, fully grasping the sheer insanity of his actions. This was beyond reckless. Even if this skyrocketed his power, the toll on his mind would be catastrophic. As she desperately tried to talk some sense into him, the young man just gave her a quiet, heartbreaking look. He flat out admitted that he was utterly devoid of talent. Despite carrying such agonizing handicaps, his progress was still crawling at a pathetic pace. Witnessing that crushing wall between raw effort and natural genius, Baek Sogo found herself wondering what kind of man was truly hiding underneath all that grit. Lee Sung-min was chasing a dream thousands of miles out of his league, and Flam had just handed him the brutal blueprint to actually reach it. If he ever wanted to breathe the same air as those god-tier geniuses, in that heavy moment, the gravity of his choice finally clicked for her. A thick silence swallowed them both. Then a soft smile crept onto her face as she realized the terrifying scale of his ambition. Baek Sogo was fighting to become the absolute strongest in the world herself, so she completely resonated with his hunger. The boy just blinked at her, completely lost. He suddenly remembered shamelessly begging her to teach him her footwork techniques a while back. She had brushed it off as a total joke back then, but right now, she was dead serious about passing it down. She handed over an elite secret manual called Shadowless Soul Flight. It wasn't just footwork, it was a rare mystic art packing every single secret she knew about ultimate speed. Thumbing through the ancient pages, he was absolutely paralyzed by its brilliance. Even Sogo wasn't entirely sure why she was handing over her most prized possession, but she knew one thing for sure. This kid was never going to throw in the towel. From this second forward, he was strictly told to call her senior sister. Flashing him a warm smile, she gently confessed that she genuinely cared about him and wanted to watch his back. Plus, she always prided herself on being the kind of person who pulled others out of the mud. With that settled, our fiercely driven hero dove straight back into his hellish training. Keeping the burning memory of Ouija Hoyon locked in his mind, he flawlessly chained the supreme spear of the 9 heavens right into his sole pursuit strike. By the time he hit the 5th stance, devastating streaks of lethal lightning were already violently tearing through his mind. He envisioned the sheer devastation his flesh and bones would endure, clashing against Hoyon. And that was with over a decade of grueling blood, sweat, and tears under. Yet conquering the little celestial demon remained an impossible pipe dream. Ultimately, Hoyon coldly declared that passing her martial arts down to him was a massive blunder, and completely washed her hands of him. Wielding her overwhelming aura, she ruthlessly reclaimed every ounce of power she had gifted him. After shattering his core to pieces, his days as a martial artist were permanently vaporized. As she turned her back and faded into the distance, Sungmin screamed out for his only friend in pure despair. Every single agonizing step tore his muscles apart, flooding his veins with absolute terror. Sungmin Lee snapped awake from that suffocating nightmare of Ouija Hoyon. He sat there completely soaked in cold sweat, with his heart hammering against his ribs, before it finally clicked it was just a phantom memory. Releasing a heavy sigh of relief, he fought to calm his violently trembling hands. That was when his eyes locked onto the mysterious girl looming over him. Jumping out of his skin, he glared at Scarlet, who had been quietly stalking his sleep. She wasted no time bringing up his latest reckless stunts, specifically piling on even more punishing restrictions. Her suffocating proximity put him instantly on edge, and the pungent stench radiating off her actually burned his retinas. Dripping with heavy sarcasm, she shredded his life choices, crushed his fragile hopes, and bluntly predicted his upcoming funeral. His stomach was already churning from her lethal body odor when Doc Go Jun suddenly stepped onto the scene. They had not tracked him down for small talk. They were here to throw him a lifeline. He scrambled to figure out why this bizarre duo was suddenly crashing his misery. Scarlet rolled her eyes and bluntly repeated that they were here to drag Sungmin. The silent woman had dispatched them, heavily armed with mystical artifacts. The second it clicked that Baek So-go was pulling the strings, everything made perfect sense. Scarlet tossed over a stack of arcane scrolls, packed with high-level incantations ready for him to. Armed with these cheat codes, weaving spells would become an absolute breeze. Doc Go Jun, on the other hand, brought a much more brutal brand of assistance, forging the kid's fragile body into a weapon capable of surviving those agonizing restrictions. His eyes burning with fierce resolve, the young warrior braced himself for hell. Right then and there, the duo threw him into the meat grinder. Scarlet drilled 4 distinct mystical arts into his brain, kicking things off with a mental purge. This spell acted as a psychic scrub, washing away the toxic sludge those vicious nightmares left behind. The next incantation was a raw, unpolished buff, designed to rapidly bulk up his physical specs. That made it an absolute lifesaver for surviving, the soul-crushing gravity curse. While trading brutal blows with Doc Go Jun, he triggered the 3rd spell to burn away his deep exhaustion. It acted like a shot of pure adrenaline, instantly refilling his gas tank. But abusing the trick would cannibalize his own lifespan and violently backfire. Even so, if he wanted to crawl out of this living hell in one piece, he had to bite the bullet. Yet, despite stacking all those buffs, his clash against the sightless Grandmaster was an absolute massacre. He crumbled to the dirt in less than 100 seconds, spitting blood. Sungmin swore he would bridge the gap next time. Without warning, a searing wave of supernatural heat violently convulsed through his entire nervous. Doc Go Jun immediately stepped in, striking precise pressure points across the boy's torso to forcefully regulate his wildly spiking. Within moments, the agonizing tremors began to fade. The phantom blade actively manipulated the kid's arteries, kicking his metabolic rate into hyperdrive, so his body could actively combat the punishing restriction. Having stabilized the rookie, the veteran silently turned his back. He muttered that tracking down a decent punching bag on this desolate peak was a rare treat. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Sungmin Lee knew for a fact he would be if these monsters had not stepped in. Ever since turning back the clock, his supporting cast had been shockingly merciful. Dwelling on that shift, a cold chill of suspicion crept in. The world was never this forgiving. From the moment he opened his eyes in the past, strangers had constantly handed him golden tickets that his previous life never saw. Further up the trail, Scarlet barked at the grizzled master, who was already wrinkling his nose at her toxic cloud from 50 paces away. She snapped at him, deeply offended that she was catching heat just for skipping the shower for a couple of days. The odd pair shifted the topic back to Sung-min Lee and the sheer amount of babysitting they were putting in. For a battle junkie who usually breathed nothing but swordplay, the veteran was currently sheltering the rookie with shocking devotion. And he was not the only softie. Scarlet had literally bled herself dry, crafting those arcane texts from scratch. Taking a step back, neither of these lone wolves could figure out why they were playing guardian angel. They just possessed this nagging gut feeling that letting him die was not an option. Meanwhile, Sung-min actively shoved those paranoid thoughts aside. In this second playthrough, he firmly decided to just shut up and enjoy his unbelievable streak of dumb luck. Fast forward 6 brutal months, and the young fighter clenched his polearm until his knuckles turned white. He remained buried deep within the treacherous woods, grinding endlessly in total isolation. His hollow eyes screamed pure exhaustion, yet tapping out was never in his vocabulary. Chilling nearby, a shadow mocked his pathetic struggles, branding him a miserable little maggot. But even that harsh critic was secretly blown away, openly admitting they never expected the kid to survive this long. The battered warrior remained firmly planted in the dirt. He kept his mouth totally shut. He had been ghosting this phantom heckler since day one. Honestly, it was highly likely he had triggered a silencing curse, willingly locking away his own voice at the 6-month milestone just to minimize distractions. Never shutting up, the relentless voice hammered away, claiming they fully expected Sung-min to intentionally stack the most lethal restrictions possible. In a flash, the spearman grounded his heavy weapon. The phantom spectator scrutinized his stance. This kid was a completely different beast compared to the fragile rookie from 6 months prior. His evasive footwork, core balance, and sheer fluidity were now sharp, surgical, and utterly lethal. The profound martial arts he absorbed from Baek So-go fit his The mysterious spectator scoffed, assuming even a pathetic grub could eventually sprout wings, if it just kept dragging itself through the dirt. Chuckling with malice, he sneered that groveling on the ground was the Sung-min tuned out the toxic venom, completely engrossed in his relentless grind. Finally snapping, the observer drew his blade. He angrily demanded to know why he was being treated like thin air, boasting that Sung-min's every flinch and twitch gave away his true thoughts anyway. Exhausted to his core, the young warrior sighed inwardly, wondering if this creep had literally zero hobbies. Make no mistake, though, he sensed the lethal aura dripping from the man. Still, a twisted sense of security grounded him. The absolute law of the mountain strictly forbade murder, meaning his life was technically safe. Suddenly, bam! A brutal strike slammed into him. The teenager crashed into the dirt, entirely blindsided by the blistering speed of the blow. His tormentor erupted into vicious laughter, mocking the pitiful sight of him squirming like a crushed insect. The bastard had actually discovered a loophole to inflict pain without breaking the sacred rule. Brandishing his gleaming blade, the man taunted that Sung-min could never replicate this feat. The weapon pulsed with raw, concentrated aura, a literal sword of ki. The vicious mocking continued, tearing into the boy's lack of talent. While Sung-min bled for every single inch of progress, monsters like him could effortlessly shatter those same barriers and ascend. Yet our hero simply bit down and pushed forward, leaving his abuser utterly stunned. In the eyes of the spectator, this path offered absolutely nothing. For a tragic soul cursed with zero natural talent, throwing his life away in endless training felt like a But Sung-min fiercely refused to bow down. No matter how many agonizing years it demanded, he would drag his battered body forward, inch by grueling inch. Let the bastard choke on his own arrogance. Someday, Sung-min swore to plunge his spear straight through that smug elite chest. Ignoring the flashy display of power, the team kept his mouth shut. Instead, he channeled his boiling rage, sinking his spear violently into the battered tree trunk. The imposing man instantly decoded the silent, lethal promise radiating from the boy's strike. Standing tall, his aura felt like a crushing mountain. With a cold smirk, the tyrant finally backed off, declaring that if Sung-min truly believed his own hype, he would eagerly await the day they crossed blades for real. Our hero had zero intention of crumbling into dust right before the finish line. Flash forward 30 days, marking a grueling 365 days of sheer hell on the mountain for Lee Sung-min. Now the ultimate crossroads arrived, selecting his next curse. He boldly locked in the restriction of hearing, plunging himself into absolute psychological torture. Instantly, his eardrums were bombarded by a screeching. Burdened by 6 crushing penalties, the boy teetered on the razor's edge of death, 24/7. Yet his hands never stopped carving the air with his trusted spear. His refined footwork allowed him to slip past invisible attacks, plant his feet like steel roots, and deliver lethally precise thrusts. He relentlessly honed the legendary, supreme spear of the 9 heavens, fused it with the arcane Violet Dawn techniques, and mastered the ghostly, shadowless soul flight. Every brutal Scarlet unfortunately offered basically nothing to his explosive growth. Ironically, as Lee Sung-min's raw power surged, an invisible crushing weight settled deep into his bones. Rations turned into absolute ash in his mouth, while vicious nightmares violently shredded his sleep. The bone-deep, icy tremors practically paralyzed him at night. The screeching static echoing in his skull was agonizing, but it had one massive perk. It completely drowned out Flam's irritating, condescending trap. Scraping by bloody step, our resilient underdog forged genuine strength. Later, standing before the enigmatic Mush, he bluntly demanded to know why he had been abruptly summoned. Considering his next demonic curse was still weeks away, she simply met his gaze with a warm smile and applauded him for surviving the hidden trial. Totally baffled, the boy's mind drew an absolute blank. Out of nowhere, Flam materialized directly in his face, making the young warrior practically jump out of his own skin. Mush smoothly revealed that the arrogant loudmouth Flam was actually the living embodiment of the trial itself. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces violently locked into place. Legends like Baek Sogo Scarlet and Doko Jun had cemented their names as absolute titans across the entire realm of area. Yet the name Flam had never once popped. Wielding that terrifying level of godlike aura, there was absolutely no way that the mind-bending twist Flam was literally a phantom, an entity that never truly existed in the physical. The phantom smirked, explaining that his sole purpose was to weaponize his overwhelming ki, designed specifically to shatter the mental fortitude of aspiring martial artists. Even generational prodigies would take one look at his monstrous strength and spiral into a black hole of depression. They would lose their sanity and scramble down the mountain in pure terror. But our tenacious hero was built totally different. Stripped of any natural gifts, he willingly dived headfirst into the meat grinder, treating the phantom not as a nightmare, but as his ultimate prey. It was practically suicidal. Yet the ghost's relentless torment had completely failed to snap the boy's iron will. Ultimately, that sheer, unadulterated madness secured his victory. Mush issued a bone-chilling warning: leak Flam's true identity to the... Regardless of the terrifying threats, the young underdog locked his focus, dead set on surviving the brutal wilderness. The ultimate payout for surviving this psychological hellscape was put on layaway, waiting for him the moment he finally descended the peaks. The entity threw down a devil's bargain, offering a terrifying boost of strength, rivaling a century of sweat and blood, for the low price of his very soul. Lee Sung-min shot it down without skipping a beat. He vastly preferred to embrace the agonizing grind, carving out his power, drop by painful drop. This sheer defiance forced the teen into deep reflection about his own absolute limits. Deep down, he despised the concept of hard work. No matter how many buckets of sweat and blood he poured out, he perpetually lagged behind the golden children, blessed by the heavens. However, raw talent didn't give those prodigies a free pass to slack off. Ultimately, what truly disgusted him were the hypocrites who downplayed a massive genetic lottery by chalking it all up to... Ironically, he had practically weaponized the word grind since his previous miserable life, using that same bitter underdog mentality as his ultimate bulletproof armor. He'd been handed way too many miraculous second chances to keep crying about his unfair starting line. That pathetic safety net was completely shattered. Now his only option was to plow straight ahead. For the very first time, he was pouring his absolute soul into the grind. Despite the agonizing pain, Lee Sung-min swore he'd ride it out to the bitter end, simply because he wanted this. Seeing that raw determination, Mush's face lit up with a brilliant smile. Pivoting away, she casually asked if she could just think out loud for a second. In the world of area, she murmured, coincidences simply didn't exist. Every single event snapped into a grand, deliberate puzzle. This realm dragged in travelers from across dimensions and galaxies, yet the actual reason remained a massive, bleeding mystery. Listening closely, our hero caught on Mush wasn't just babbling to the wind. Her words were aimed right at his chest. She was slipping him classified intel she was strictly forbidden from saying out loud. The mysterious girl fell dead silent. If he had actually spun back time, it meant an apocalyptic threat was brewing, one that desperately demanded his regression. He had to harden himself, forging a weapon worthy of whatever cosmic force hurled him into the past. She wrapped up her little monologue with a cheerful grin, though deep anxiety flickered in her eyes. Throwing a single hand into the air, she fiercely claimed this turf as her own, warning an unseen intruder to back off, unless they craved absolute annihilation. Space itself began to splinter, jagged cracks, ripping wide open into gaping, pitch-black void. Completely lost in the chaos, our hero froze in his tracks until Moosh ordered him to retreat. He needed to finish his grueling training. Every ticking second counted. Before he could even spit out a response, she forcefully warped him away. Honestly, she had no clue if Lee Sung-min could block the incoming nightmare. He desperately needed to grasp the endgame waiting for him. Fast forward a few days, and he locked in his 6th brutal trial, the prohibition of smell. A suffocating stench radiating from Scarlett's hair ruthlessly assaulted his senses. Maybe nuking his own sense of smell was a massive mistake. Right then, a woman carrying an incredibly eerie vibe materialized by his side. But the trade-off was simple. The more torturous the restriction, the more explosive his power growth. So fighting through violent waves of nausea, he swallowed the... Nearby Baek Sogo was carrying the crushing burdens of lost taste and hearing. Stacked against her past traumas, this fresh hell felt suffocating. Stripping away her literal senses proved to be a far more brutal nightmare than she had ever anticipated. The young warrior perked up when she quietly mentioned she had something important to say. With a rock-solid tone, she dropped the bomb she was packing up and leaving the mountain. They locked eyes, a heavy, silent understanding passing between them. Let's be real, Baek Sogo never needed to subject herself to this torture. She was already cemented as a generational prodigy. 2 grueling years on this peak had pushed her past her ultimate limits. Stunned, Argai asked if she was actually walking away. She gave a firm nod. He, on the other hand, was stubbornly staying behind. A deep pang of sorrow flashed in her eyes, fully realizing their paths were finally splitting. Despite the painful goodbye, she confidently promised they'd cross paths again. Baek Sogo softly gazed at the young man she had bled alongside on this punishing cliff. The fragile kid she once knew had forged himself into an absolute beast, but her gut twisted with fear. If she left, he might fatally overdose on these lethal curses. He was riding dangerously close to the edge, making her seriously consider staying back just to master his training in shadowless soul flight. But Lee Sung-min gently cut her off, swearing he could hold his own. Thanks to her guidance, he had learned to eat the pain, and now he could carry his own massive weight. Pouring his heart out, he thanked her, openly admitting he'd be a corpse without her help. Hearing those raw words, a warm, radiant smile bloomed. Closing the gap, she pulled him into a tight, emotional embrace. Completely blindsided, he awkwardly stiffened before letting his iron defenses melt away. His hardened features finally softened, melting into her deeply genuine hug. Pulling back just an inch, Baek Sogo looked him in the eyes and called him the most unyielding fighter she'd ever encountered. The deeper she looked into his soul, the more she realized his drive wasn't the frantic He chuckled at that, confessing he had been completely shattered countless times. But he just refused to stay down. Totally awestruck, she called him incredible, confessing that watching him made her finally surrender her own fiery demons. Locking onto his gaze, she pleaded from the bottom of her heart, "Please don't die on me." Without missing a beat, he echoed the exact. He was going to survive no matter what. Soon after, Baek Sogo, Dokebi Jun, and Scarlet all packed up and vanished down the mountain. For the first time in years, a crushing wave of loneliness hit him. In his pathetic past life, he was a paranoid stray who trusted absolutely no one. But now, he finally understood that a man couldn't survive on an island. Without that loyal crew, his bones would already be dust. Standing perfectly still, he locked his eyes onto a bright streak tearing across. Something deep within his core violently shifted, shattering the steel vault around his heart. For one transcendent split second, all smell, weight, and sound completely. That fleeting taste of pure liberation felt like an eternity, totally warping the ordinary world around him. Just as his soul had been reborn, the entire universe felt completely rewritten. Searing summer finally rolled in, carried by the deafening roar of cicadas. Fast forward 7 years, and a grim fate awaits. Baek Sogo is destined to cross paths with Weiji Hoyun in the cold depths of a dungeon, only to meet a brutal end at her hands. Driven by a fierce need to repay her past kindness, he vowed to shatter that tragic timeline. He lashed out, stomping at a nearby insect, but the elusive cicada slipped right through his grasp. Much like a cicada burying itself in the dirt for 10 long years before breaking the surface, he had exactly 7 years to avert this incoming catastrophe. Whether he evolved into an unstoppable force or fell short, it didn't matter. His martial prowess sharpened with each passing dawn, yet the progress felt agonizingly slow. Craving absolute power, he pushed his body past the breaking point, completely abandoning sleep to relentlessly drill his. Navigating the world completely blind wasn't some mystical secret. To survive the suffocating void of his stolen vision, he hyper-focused his remaining senses, etching every single inch of the rocky terrain. As absolute darkness swallowed his reality, Lee Sung-min clung to the rough sensation of touch as his only lifeline. After one grueling week, he finally managed to creep forward, anchored purely by the faint echoes cutting through the pitch-black abyss. Slowly, those hollow noises morphed. Hypnotized by that sound, he endlessly thrust his spear, completely losing his grip on the flow of time. Muscle memory took over, and his body flawlessly executed deadly martial arts forms. His mind sank into a profound trance. Much like a fragile larva desperately yearning to break free as a winged cicada, his soul hungered for. Yet that tiny taste of power wasn't enough. An undeniable hunger gnawed at him. Lost in thought, he couldn't grasp his ultimate purpose, nor could he figure out why he was sent back in time to begin with. Summer bled into winter, the shifting breeze biting his skin. Even so, his grueling routine remained locked in an endless loop. He did nothing but relentlessly twirl his spear, slowly blending into the pitch-black void. Suddenly, Mush manifested inside her domain. Lee Sung-min prayed for this agonizing test to wrap up. A few sunsets later, a strange sensation washed over his limbs. Finally, Mush restored his missing senses. Vision rushed back to his eyes. The sickening stench and deafening shrieks vanished completely. A refreshing lightness filled his bones, completely chasing away the bone-deep frost. Mush observed him closely, silently debating the perfect prize for his efforts. Lee Sung-min had endured 3 agonizing years on that cursed peak. He swallowed every brutal restriction without breaking. Most challengers who flew too close to the sun ended up dead or completely shattered. Honestly, she felt thrilled a survivor like him finally showed up. He absolutely earned a top-tier prize. With a cool gaze, Mush asked what his heart desired. Bursting with hype, he blurted out that he wanted to brawl like Bruce Lee, but quickly scrapped that foolish thought. Taking a deep breath, he dug into his mind to pinpoint his ultimate goal. The clock was ticking mercilessly. He desperately needed raw strength. Eyes sparking with ambition, he demanded overwhelming power, even though he barely understood the weight of that request. He boldly asked if Mush could hand over that kind of firepower. The deity carefully shot back, pointing out that what he truly lacked was time. His jaw dropped at the realization she could actually manipulate time. Carving a glowing seal onto his flesh, she commanded him to flash it in front of Denadar and Dramor. Denadar, the god of time, would be his next judge. As a parting gift, she gave him a chilling warning to watch his back, since Denadar's gauntlets were way more brutal than anything she threw at him. Ultimately, his survival rested squarely on his own shoulders, with a terrifying destiny lurking in the shadows. Flashing a cocky grin, he declared that he wouldn't want it any other way. Now that his path was locked in, they jumped straight to his payoff for surviving 3 brutal years on the summit. Chuckling, he praised Mush as one seriously generous goddess. For his grand prize, she summoned a slick guy rocking a tailored suit. This was Neville, a smooth-talking broker from Arabrisa, who offered a polite bow to our hero. Neville raised an eyebrow, asking Mush if this ragged kid was her highly recommended recruit. Honestly, he severely doubted the boy had what it takes to enter the elite guild. Mush simply smirked and told Neville to look a little closer. The second he did, the broker stammered out an apology. It hit him like a truck. This kid was way beyond qualified. He had completely misjudged him by just scanning his basic aura. For a teenager, that kind of lethal skill commanded instant respect across the realm. Shifting gears, they dove into the insane perks of the legendary Arabrisa Guild. This massive network tackled shady deals, bounties, high-stakes auctions, and priceless intel. They could hunt down literally anything a client craved. Intrigued, our guy asked if they dealt in rare elixirs or mythical combats. Neville flashed a confident smile, confirming they had it all. The syndicate even vaulted the legendary Shaolin healing potion and Manhwa's mythical cherry blossom sword art. Tracking down impossible-to-find treasures was exactly Arabrisa's bread and butter. Even Mush, who wasn't officially on the roster, occasionally blew her cash there. A shadowy black market, boasting a literal god as a VIP client, was mind-blowing. Stepping forward, Neville offered a welcoming handshake. He smoothly invited the kid into the fold. Figuring he had absolutely zero to lose, our hero took the deal. Neville quickly produced a glowing contract. Pointing to the dotted line, he instructed the kid to sign. In a flash of light, he officially stepped into the ranks of Arabrisa. With a crisp snap of his fingers, Neville delivered a sweet signing bonus. Instantly, our hero's entire ragged appearance transformed. He suddenly looked sharp, decked out in fresh gear and a clean haircut. Tipping his hat, Neville bid him farewell. The broker told him to just ping the guild whenever he needed backup. Mush tilted her head asking if the makeover hit the spot, and Lee Sung-min nodded with a satisfied grin. Getting access to Arabrisa was an absolute jackpot, giving him every right to be hyped. Plotting his next move, he declared Behanger as his very first target. However, the goddess cut in, sternly warning him never to lose sight of his true mission. She strictly commanded him to carve her advice into his skull. As he hiked down the trail, her echoing whispers looped endlessly in his mind. Someone intentionally pulled the strings of his time travel. He was so caught up in solving the mystery that he completely missed the savage predators closing in. Yet facing down monstrous fangs, he didn't even flinch. His brain was totally locked on the fact that his regression was no random accident. Dodging fatal strikes, he relentlessly mentally chewed on the identity of the mastermind playing him like a chess piece. Gripping his spear tight, he shoved those heavy questions to the back burner and launched a brutal counterattack. Surviving 3 hellish years of isolation had pushed him to the absolute pinnacle of combat at barely 18. It was completely absurd. Any outsider would instantly label him a prodigy. But he knew the ugly truth. He clawed his way up through divine handouts and blood-soaked agony. His new objective was crystal clear: ruthlessly exploit every single opportunity. After wiping out the beast pack, he marched toward Behanger with eyes full of fire. Flashing a smirk, he made up his mind to dive into the mercenary life. The mythical Devnar armor was secretly stashed away in the Black Mage's underground labyrinth, right outside Behanger. In his past timeline, some lucky C-rank chump had stumbled onto that artifact. That gear was ridiculously overpowered. It packed enough juice to instantly catapult a C-rank mercenary straight into the 2nd or 3rd tier. A lesser warrior wearing it would hit peak martial artist level, while a peak master might shatter their limits and ascend to the supreme realm. Lingering on the mountain was tempting, but letting this golden opportunity slip away simply wasn't an option. The clock was ticking. In exactly 1.5 years, the infamous Black Mage's dungeon would be complete. Before that countdown hit 0, he had to carve out a name for himself as a mercenary in Berenger. Stepping into the local guild, the young warrior slammed his demand on the counter. Polishing a glass, the bartender blinked in utter confusion, wondering why this random kid was spilling his life story. If the brat wanted a mercenary badge, he needed to march his boots upstairs and bother the A burly patron hunched over his meal scoffed, choking on a cruel laugh at the mere thought of this scrawny kid surviving in the field. In a blur of motion, the jeering man's fingers grasped at empty air. His silver fork was gone now, twirling effortlessly between the boy's fingers. As the bewildered thug patted down the table, the bartender's eyes widened. That blinding, dropping the tough guy act, the bartender scrambled to apologize hurriedly, pulling out a chair while murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd. Settling into the booth, the man finally dropped his disguise. He introduced himself as manager Baron, the actual shot caller, running the Berenger Guild branch. Our hero just stared deadpan, thoroughly unimpressed by Baron's cheesy excuse that he slung drinks on the first floor, just for the thrill. Memories flared. This exact guild hall had been his very first stepping stone in his previous life. Shuffling through the paperwork, Baron admitted that a fighter of his caliber would instantly snag a prestigious S-rank badge. However, the manager wasn't blind. Staring back at him was a raw, untested. The guild desperately needed muscle, but titles weren't handed out like candy. The boy had to bleed to. Sliding a bounty across the table, Baron laid out a fitting trial. He'd pair the kid with a veteran S-ranker, survive the hunt, and the golden rank was his. By dawn the next day, they were on the move. The veteran scowled, already grinding his teeth at his new partner's maddening, stone-cold silence. Initially, the seasoned merc assumed he was babysitting the cocky punk, who pulled that flashy fork trick back at the tavern. He couldn't have been more wrong. No matter the banter, the boy remained an unreadable, emotionless wall. Despite the icy demeanor, his escort admitted the kid would likely become a fan favorite. That veteran was Lude, a top-tier S-rank mercenary they had never crossed paths with before. Yet that name echoed clearly from his past life. Assigned as his backup, Lude was definitely just the guild's watchdog, heavily scrutinizing the rookie's every move. Leaning in with a smirk, Lude asked if the kid had ever tangled with an ogre. Without missing a beat, the young warrior coldly replied, "Never." These beasts were apex predators, hulking titans, cloaked in magic-deflecting steel-hard skin. Their target, a rogue ogre terrorizing the woods near a helpless settlement. Trudging through the brush, Lude confidently bragged that 2 elite S-rankers could easily butcher the beast. But a creeping unease hung in the air. The terrain felt suffocatingly cramped for an ogre's territory, prompting the protagonist to shoot Lude a questioning glare. Lude grimly explained the math. These monsters towered at nearly 10 feet, and some pushed past 16, meaning they possessed bottomless appetites. This tiny patch of woods couldn't possibly sustain one. "Stop!" The boy's sharp command sliced through the silence. Lude's hand shot to his hilt, demanding what was wrong. Up ahead, a mutilated deer corpse painted the dirt red. That gruesome, bone-shattering force easily matched a typical ogre's, yet chunks of flesh remained untouched. The predator hadn't stopped to feed. Lude couldn't even catch the beast's foul stench, making the scene incredibly eerie. Suddenly, a guttural, terrifying rumble vibrated through the earth. A colossal force was tearing through the woods, barreling directly toward them. Weapons slid from their sheaths as the hunters locked eyes, bracing for impact. Roaring, they launched themselves forward, just as a nightmarish behemoth erupted from the tree line, splintering massive trunks like toothpicks. Blood turned to ice in their veins. Lude's confidence shattered into sheer panic. This horrific monstrosity matched absolutely zero guild reports. His survival instincts screamed. This was a slaughter waiting to happen. Their only logical move was to sprint for their lives. Boasting razor-sharp talons and a grotesquely swollen muscular frame, this wasn't a natural beast. It was a bioengineered nightmare, a modified chimera ogre. Chimeras were forbidden arcane experiments, stitched together from various deadly species, to forge the ultimate limit-breaking killing machine. Even a pathetic goblin tossed into a chimera vat mutated into a lethal B-rank threat. Measuring this thing's true danger level was practically impossible, but using an ogre as the foundation, that was apocalyptic. A monster like this would effortlessly rip fully stacked S-rank teams to bloody shreds. For the first time, a cold shiver snaked down our hero's spine, as the towering abomination bulldozed mercilessly through the forest. Splinters rained down like shrapnel, but his feet stayed planted. Retreat wasn't an option. With a deafening bellow, the freakish ogre lunged its massive fist, hurtling straight for his skull. Scrambling backward, Lude screamed a frantic warning. Time slowed as the young warrior narrowed his eyes, waiting for the absolute perfect microsecond to leap aside. Activating shadowless soul flight and untraceable steps, he slipped through the deadly strike like a ghost. Crouched behind a ruined trunk, Lude's jaw hit the floor at the rookie's godlike agility. The grueling confines of Mercy's Mountain were far behind him. The crushing physical restrictions holding back his true potential had finally vanished. In this boundless battlefield, victory was his for the taking. Merging shadowless soul flight with the lethal rhythm of shadow dance, he became a deadly blur, launching his counter. Scaling the beast's massive frame, he caught its gaze, locking onto him. Without hesitation, he unleashed the supreme spear of the 9 heavens. The attack resonated with the deadly, soul-chasing kill blow. Yet Lee Sung-min instantly felt the terrifying weight of the battle ahead. The monster's hide was like impenetrable armor. Even a point-blank strike glanced off harmlessly, and his blazing chi sword failed to leave even a single scratch. Watching from the sidelines, Ludi realized the bounty wouldn't change from a standard ogre, making this suicidal gamble entirely pointless. Fleeing was no longer an option, so he readied his weapon to assist. But suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind, commanding him to stand down. Recognizing the telepathic sound transmission, Ludi froze in his tracks. Sung-min completely understood the sheer lethality of the abomination and refused to let his companion enter the kill zone. Through the mental link, he sharply reminded Lude that he lacked any real experience battling an ogre. Despite grasping the immense threat before him, the boy remained utterly baffled as to why his blade couldn't Yet, Lee Sung-min's confidence never wavered. He fully believed he could slaughter the chimera. Gripping his shaft tight, he triggered the supreme spear of the 9 heavens once more. Infused with the crackling power of the lightning-splitting strike, the devastating blow connected perfectly. But as he yanked the weapon free, the beast barely flinched. Witnessing the monster shrug off the damage pushed Lude deeper into absolute panic. He knew with terrifying certainty that his own attacks would be completely worthless. However, Lee Sung-min firmly stood his ground, his spear leveled and ready. Staring back, the monster's glowing eyes burned with mounting irritation. Launching himself forward, he leaped high into the air, vaulting right over the massive brute. He locked onto its eyes, the only vulnerable target softer than its concrete. His tip pierced the eyeball with surgical precision. Having already blinded its senses using a crimson thread distraction, he ruthlessly exploited the opening. Despite his young age, he moved like a seasoned veteran, while the shrieking abomination frantically clawed at the burning pain in its face. Sensing the blade dig deep, he relentlessly pushed the assault, but then a bizarre twist shattered his momentum. The tide of battle should have shifted instantly, but reality proved far crueler. The ruptured eyeball rapidly stitched itself back together, completely restoring its form. A chilling realization hit him. The beast possessed immense regenerative powers. This twisted chimera had been mutated with the hyper-healing blood of a troll. In a heartbeat, his odds of survival plummeted into the abyss. Maintaining icy composure, Lee Sung-min scanned for a new tactical angle, just as the monstrous mutant wound up for a brutal counterattack. Lude screamed his name in sheer terror, but the young warrior remained planted like a mountain. The image of Baek Sogo flashed through his mind, sparking a fierce reminder of the promises he still needed to fulfill. Dying in this hellhole simply wasn't an option. The three fundamental pillars of spear arts had been drilled into his very soul through endless grueling days of training. Watching the hulking nightmare charge memories of Weiji Ho Yun and the agonizing torment of his past regiments flooded his senses. Leveling his weapon directly at the beast's swinging fists, he knew the time had come to unleash every ounce of power he had meticulously forged. Requiring immense explosive force to pivot and deflect the catastrophic incoming strike, he exploded into motion. The terrifying chimera loomed over him, not a single scratch marring its pristine flesh. Undeterred, he dashed head-on toward the towering giant. Raising his blade high, he locked onto the absolute perfect strike zone. He required absolute mastery to weave his shaft right through the enemy's devastating swing. Employing razor-sharp footwork, he ghosted dangerously close to its gargantuan razor-sharp talent. Finally securing the flawless leverage needed to execute his technique, he prepared the final blow. Lude watched the breathtaking sequence with wide, unblinking eyes. Delivering a surgically precise impact, the young fighter clenching the hilt with white knuckles, he unleashed a furious storm of slashing strikes, while the massive beast desperately scrambled to regain its footing. Lee Sung-min viciously plunged his spear deep into the monster's leg. Instantly, he felt the satisfying crunch of a critical blow. A blood-curdling shriek erupted from the chimera's grotesquely stitched lips. His theory proved flawless. The anatomical joints were severely compromised. As the enraged beast lunged violently to crush him, he was already perfectly positioned for the counter. Disoriented, the abomination attempted a far more calculated smash. It brought a monstrous hand crashing down to pulverize him, only for the boy to swiftly evade death once more. A quick thought raced through his mind. How fast could this freakish mutation regenerate torn ligaments? With he fiercely launched another assault. The sheer kinetic impact violently snapped his weapon cleanly in half. Yet the brute force successfully slammed the giant down onto a single knee. With the jagged, splintered shaft firmly lodged inside its flesh, the rapid healing process abruptly halted. Seeing his brilliant gamble pay off, a cold smirk spread across Lee Sung-min's face. Wielding the broken remnant left in his grip, he ruthlessly targeted its arm, effectively crippling the mutant's legs and right limb. Utterly incapacitated, the beast was forced to awkwardly support its massive weight on a single trembling hand. While agonizing tremors, he instantly recognized that one final fatal blow would end it all. Channeling every ounce of his aura, he ignited his very own Lee Sung-min variation of the supreme spear of the nine heavens, seamlessly infused with the crackling. The devastating maneuver connected with terrifying lethality. Riddled with grievous injuries, the monstrous chimera violently swayed, unable to hold its ground. Desperately thrashing its lone remaining arm, the beast unleashed but the sluggish attack struck only empty air. Freed from the crushing physical weights of his mountain training, he finally realized the breathtaking speed he truly possessed. Suddenly the familiar piercing cry of cicadas echoed in his ears, the exact same haunting melody from Mount Mercy. Closing the distance on he swore a silent oath to never remain a helpless insect buzzing in the dirt. Back on that cursed peak, he had merely been a fragile larva waiting to evolve. All those grueling hours of blood and sweat weren't meant to keep him powerless. Even if his ultimate destiny was still a blank page, staying at the bottom of the food chain just wasn't an option anymore. He lunged, driving a savage blow right into the chimera's eyes, sending the colossal beast slamming into the dirt, gripping his weapon tight like the pathetic existence of his past life. He was going to carve a bloody path forward, no matter what twisted fate lay ahead. Watching from the sidelines, Lude was absolutely paralyzed by the sheer spectacle. Unleashing a guttural battle cry, the kid plunged his blade straight into the abomination's core. Jaw hanging open in pure disbelief, Lude couldn't breath ragged. The young warrior practically collapsed inward. He stared down at his own shredded, blistered palms. Honestly, if someone asked him what he was right now, he wouldn't have a clue. But one truth burned bright in his mind. He was no longer a helpless grub. To Lude, that bizarre metaphor went straight over his head, but it only added to the kid's undeniable, dangerous aura. Just a few feet away, a lifeless cicada rested in the dust. Catching sight of the silenced bug, a faint, melancholic smile tugged at the cut to the bustling guild hall, where the resident barkeep was scratching his head, utterly bewildered, as he inspected the towering, mangled corpse. Lude quickly broke down the absolute chaos that had just unfolded. Taking down a freakish chimera ogre, that was a god-tier double S-class achievement. Bureaucracy, though, meant they couldn't just hand out that legendary title on the spot. Still, the kid wasn't complaining about the prestige. The bounty for slaying the monstrosity clocked in at a staggering 27 million urs, paired with a shiny new S-Class insignia. On top of that, auctioning the beast's carcass to the mercenary researchers raked in an additional 20 million urs. Dumping the massive payload into the kid's hands, Lude made it crystal clear the victor takes the spoils. A mind-blowing total of 47 million ears. Strolling down the cobblestone alleys, a euphoric rush of absolute victory coursed through his veins. That kind of wealth was straight out of a fever dream. Back in his previous miserable existence, he'd gamble his life on suicide gigs and never scraped together more than a measly 1 million urs. Now holding a king's ransom, he was totally clueless on how to blow it. Until a lightning bolt glancing down at his shattered, useless polearm, the perfect plan crystallized. Meanwhile, back at the smoky tavern, the gossip was flying. The bartender was practically begging to hear the gritty details straight from the source. With a swift tap of his enchanted staff to his own temple, the barkeep instantly downloaded a magical replay of the brutal forest showdown. His jaw practically hit the floor. Eyes wide with a mix of terror and Lude doubled down, insisting the rookie was undeniably double S material. Since he didn't have the authority to stamp the paperwork, a prodigy hitting that god-tier power cap without even picking a class. That was guaranteed to put him on Zion's radar. Smash cut to our hero standing alone in a pitch black. He shouted Neville's name into the shadows. The enigmatic figure materialized instantly, acknowledging the magical page. With a raised brow, he demanded to know what the emergency was. Up until now, our guy hadn't given 2 cents about his gear. If a piece of metal was sharp enough to pierce flesh, or heavy enough to shatter, but that nightmare brawl with the ogre was a brutal wake-up call. A premium piece of steel would have turned that bloodbath into a walk in the park. He refused to be caught dead holding garbage equipment ever again. It was time to invest in a master-crafted arsenal. Neville cut right to the chase. What's the flavor and what's the budget? Without missing a beat, Lee Sung-min slammed down his entire 47 million DRS, demanding a custom-forged masterpiece, no matter how long it took. But Neville just scoffed. 47 mil was pocket change for the legendary Smiths of Erebus. Their price tags were astronomical. Neville coldly pitched a loan offering to hold the kid's very soul as collateral. Though he warned the interest rates were literal hell, Lee Sung-min shot that demonic deal down in a heartbeat, demanding a plan B. Rubbing his chin in thought, Neville smirked, mentioning a certain underground contact who could hook him up with some serious firepower. The second the warrior gave the green light, Neville thrust a finger toward the ceiling. A sinister pulse of dark energy erupted, manifesting a swirling portal right in Lee Sung-min's face. Tapping the anomaly, Neville casually stepped back, announcing he was leaving the two of them to hash out the business. Blinking in sheer confusion, Lee Sung-min could only stare at the rift, mesmerized by Neville's insane ability to literally rip reality in half. Suddenly, a gruff voice echoed from the abyss, scoffing at how young the client was, while throwing shade about their future business prospects. The unseen stranger grunted out his name, and dragged himself through the wormhole. Squinting into the magical tier, Lee Sung-min's eyes widened. He was face to face with a genuine dark elf. Stepping into the eerie dimension, the teen rattled off his name and immediately demanded a custom spear. He shoved forward, his busted polearm asking for an upgraded clone. The elf snatched the broken metal, expertly analyzing the balance and immediately recognizing it as a jack-of-all-trades. Then came the curveball. Seldurus demanded a live demonstration of his combat forms. The kid froze. In the brutal world of martial arts, flashing your secret techniques to a stranger was a massive, lethal taboo. But the grumpy elf wasn't backing down. It was non-negotiable. Without seeing the kid in act, forging the perfect weapon was a pipe dream. Running out of patience, the artisan pinched the bridge of his nose, muttering under his breath about the absolute misery of doing. He was a 400-year-old veteran, obsessed with the forge. He'd been smashing hammers against anvils for over 350 years, fueled by pure grit instead of natural-born talent. Our hero still looked skeptical. Puffing out his chest, the elf proudly declared his craftsmanship could rival any dwarf's masterpiece. That defiant flex struck a major chord with the young warrior. Deep down, he sensed they were cut from the same underdog cloth. Catching himself rambling, the elf suddenly cursed himself for pouring his heart out to a random kid. Annoyed, he crossed his arms and told Lee Sung-min to take a hike and begged the dwarves if he wanted a flashy toy. But Lee Sung-min wasn't budging. Instead, he stubbornly offered to demonstrate his deadly forms. Surprised, the dark elf just stared, genuinely baffled that the kid actually stayed. Lee Sung-min didn't doubt the guy for a second, not after hearing he possessed 350 years of hardcore forging experience. That left the elf totally speechless. Chuckling, he called the kid way too naive. Still, Lee Sung-min didn't even flinch. Turning his back, the craftsman admitted the boy certainly had a silver tongue. A sudden spark ignited in his eyes. his whole vibe shifting dramatically, while our young warrior just stood there in dead silence. Normally a tight-fisted perfectionist, the elf resolved to forge a masterpiece, way beyond what this kid's coin purse could handle. Why he simply liked his guts. Flashing a grin, he figured this young martial artist was bound to become a VIP regular. Crafting a weapon of that caliber, however, would eat up a few months, so Lee Sung-min had zero choice but to sit tight. Retreating to his room, he crossed his legs on the mattress and sank into deep meditation. Tearing that chimera ogre apart marked his absolute first bloody clash since ascending to the pinnacle as a supreme master, and he desperately needed to unpack everything he just experienced in the mud. Weiji Hoyan had once labeled his raw awareness a sheer gift. Surviving endless grueling years isolated in those rugged mountains had fiercely forged that instinct. In the heat of combat, that primal radar dragged his body out of harm's way before his brain even processed the threat. It was absolutely terrifying power, but relying entirely on a gut feeling was a deadly gamble. The wilderness had perfectly honed his physical touch and that supernatural intuition, yet his other senses were seriously dragging their feet. Neglecting those blind spots was begging for a gruesome death. A creeping dread washed over him. Something permanently catastrophic was over at the Mercenary Guild. The atmosphere was dead quiet while the barkeep reorganized the liquor stash. The man behind the counter wondered if Lee Sung-min was already hunting for his next bounty. Instead, our hero demanded to know where the monster's carcass ended up. A chimera meant some mad scientist was secretly pulling the strings. The bartender quietly revealed that the Mage Guild was running a private, top-secret probe into the whole mess. This Frankenstein beast never once showed up in his previous timeline. That meant either nobody touched the bounty back then, or the mercenaries had been. Judging by the timing, this nightmare was probably stitched together roughly 6 months ago. Hell, maybe in his past life he was the poor soul who originally stumbled, but now he'd butchered the damn thing guaranteed to ripple and fracture the future. Arriving at the Behengar Mage Guild, an unexpectedly warm voice welcomed the young warrior. A spellcaster casually wove intricate magical runes in the air, while Lee Sung-min kept. The stranger introduced himself as Kim Jong-hyun, a legitimate dark mage, digging deep into the chimera mystery. Lee Sung-min didn't miss a beat, introducing himself as the executioner who slaughtered it. The moment he realized the kid was a fellow Korean, Kim Jong-hyun's eyes lit up eagerly, asking if his homeworld had suffered a catastrophic portal outbreak. He broke it down real quick. Portals bridging different dimensions, and vomiting monstrous anomalies straight into human territory. Just as fast, he brushed the grim topic aside, genuinely pumped to bump into a fellow Earthling in this twisted universe. But the second they pivoted back to business, the mage. Sure, hometown nostalgia was great, but he was hiding a much darker, twisted reason for his excitement. He kept that dead serious. Lee Sung-min demanded access to the mangled carcass. He desperately needed leads on the legendary Devanark armor, prompting the spellcaster to spill a fraction of his autopsy notes. The horrifying part. The abomination's flesh was still weakly pulsing. It wasn't entirely dead yet, making. Even so, one thing was crystal clear. The deranged dark mage who stitched that freak together had to be sitting at a terrifyingly high mastery level. Its gaping jaw had been brutally stitched shut with thick wire. The creator had clearly fused it with a feral hunter, using the poor bastard as a. Flashing back to the grotesque bisected corpse lying in the mud, Lee Sung-min instantly connected the bloody dots. As the young master fell completely silent, the wizard easily picked up that this kid, remaining frozen like a statue, our hero directly challenged the mage's earlier slip-up, prying into what that other secret reason. Without missing a beat, Kim Jong-hyun smugly dropped a massive bombshell, the fabric of Lee Sung-min's very existence. His karma and causality was catastrophically tangled. To a high-tiered dark mage, ripping open a mortal's soul and reading it like an open book was absolute child's play. Closing the distance, he whispered a chilling warning. If he had to shoulder the boy's cursed fate, he would have violently lost his mind, or drowned in sheer bottomless despair. Eyes narrowing, he asked if the kid even grasped the. Lee Sung-min didn't bat an eye, simply stating the absolute worst-case scenario, an eternity of agonizing torment the second his heart stopped. Baffled, the wizard pressed him, demanding to know what the hell. But our hero's paranoia was blaring. He clamped his mouth shut, refusing to drop his guard. Desperate to crack the shell, Kim Jong-hyun eagerly offered to bind his own soul, with a lethal mana oath, swearing. While the spellcaster furiously traced the binding runes, Lee Sung-min's stomach tied into knots. Yet if this lunatic was truly willing to bet his life on an oath, maybe it was time to risk opening up. Finally, exhaling deeply, he dropped the ultimate secret. He was a regressor, a ghost who had literally cheated death and rewound time itself. By shattering the sacred laws of the universe and hoarding an ungodly mountain of toxic karma before dying, the literal foundation of his timeline had mutated into a cursed, inescapable web. Absorbing that insane revelation, the Dark Mage paused, deciding to gift him one final terrifying piece of the puzzle. Lee Sung-min held his breath. Kim Jong-hyun leaned in, murmuring that the boy was a total anomaly. It wasn't just his warped karma that was wrong. His very existence as a human being felt fundamentally broken. But the instant he tried to expose the truth, a deafening shockwave shattered the room's silence. Agonizing, high-pitched static pierced Lee Sung-min's eardrums, while the wizard violently realized he was physically gagged by the universe. The cosmic laws simply refused to let the boy hear that forbidden truth. Watching this unfold, Lee Sung-min was plunged into absolute mind-numbing confusion. If Kim Jong-hyun forced another syllable out, his brain would explode. Thick crimson blood poured out of the mage's nose and eyes, just from attempting to break. In that bloody moment, the mage fully realized the horrifying reality. This kid's life was no longer his own property. He was a pawn to something much darker. Wiping the gore from his face, the wizard gasped out a choked apology, begging the boy to retreat and return another day, leaving our protagonist totally drowning in deadly, unanswered mystery. Lee Sung-min walked away, his mind spinning in circles. Suddenly memories of Mush slammed into him, how fiercely she tried to obliterate anyone foolish enough to trespass on her turf. He spun around to make his exit, but a sharp voice called his name. Glancing back, he spotted a female figure stepping out of the shadows. Closing the distance between them, she claimed she remembered his face all the way from the mountain of mush. He just stared at her, drawing a complete blank. Clearly irritated by his clueless expression, she barked that her name was Scarlet. That sparked a memory, making his gears, considering her appearance had completely transformed. After a bit of back-and-forth banter, Lee Sung-min bluntly told her to drop the constant nagging. Absolutely livid, she wound up and clocked him with everything she had. Eating that brutal punch was all it took for her true identity to finally click in his head. Brushing it off, she demanded to know what business he had snooping around the Mage Guild. He played it down as running simple errands, but the moment Kim Jong-hyun's name slipped from his lips, her entire demeanor shifted to high alert. She warned him that while dark mages gave off terrible vibes by default, that specific guy was on a whole different level of unsettling. You would have to be completely out of your mind to tangle with someone like that. Wrapping up their chat, she urged him to watch his back, admitting it was actually pretty cool catching up with an old acquaintance after all this time. Strolling away, she tossed an invitation over her shoulder, telling him to swing by her third-floor laboratory if he ever needed to kill some time. She even offered to crack some skulls if anyone dared to mess with her buddy. Tossing a final wave, she vanished, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Mush's cryptic warning echoed in his ears, clashing with that eerie sentence Kim Jong-hyun deliberately left hanging. Everyone was showering him with this unnatural kindness, and it made his skin crawl. His gut screamed that a massive conspiracy was unfolding in the shadows, yet the puzzle pieces just would not fit. The board had gotten way too, so he shoved those theories aside to lock in on the immediate threat. A massive two-headed troll, an S-rank bounty with a staggering 60 million Eries price tag on its heads. Right on cue, Lude popped up with a cheerful grin. Brimming with energy, he swore they would crush those beasts as a team, desperate to prove his worth on the battlefield. Sung-min cracked a rare smile, genuinely excited for the backup. If his second chance at life had taught him anything, it was that playing the lone wolf was a death. Lude was a fiercely loyal comrade, and his bright aura slowly chipped away at the ice around Sung-min's guarded heart. For 3 grueling months, the duo hit the road, grinding through perilous quests and stacking up rewards. Raking in the cash from their final raid, they split a cool 50 million Eries straight down the... To celebrate their massive payday, they hit the local tavern for some well-deserved drinks, but the bartender quickly leaned in, whispering that a VIP was waiting in the... Sitting in the dim light was none other than Xian, the legendary commander of the mercenary vanguard. Sung-min and Lude locked eyes, their jaws practically hitting the floor. That name commanded absolute respect. Xian was the undisputed boss of Flare, commanding a ruthless army of over 100 elite fighters, and stood tall as one of Behengar's untouchable double S-rank legends. He was a terrifying martial peak powerhouse who flawlessly executed the 100 mystic steps of the Shaolin Fists. In his past life, Sung-min practically worshipped the ground this guy walked on, and for one incredibly crucial reason. As the tension thickened, the imposing figure introduced himself, officially representing Flare. Just like Sung-min, Xian was completely classless. Now that the young warrior had clawed his own way to the martial peak, he could sense the overwhelming aura radiating off Xian, predicting he would soon ascend to supreme mastery. Breaking the ice, the captain pointed out their shared underdog status, acknowledging the brutal reality of surviving without a system class. Yet against all odds, the kid sitting across from him had broken through the martial peak at the insanely young age of 18. Cutting the small talk, Zeon dropped a massive bombshell. He wanted Sungmin to join the ranks not just as a foot soldier, but as the vice captain answering only to the boss himself. Catching the pure shock on the teenager's face, Zeon admitted it was a heavy offer to drop out of nowhere, so he slid a mysterious object across the table, urging him to weigh his options. Sungmin's breath hitched the second he realized what it was. Resting inside the velvet box was a lesser revitalization pill, an ultra-rare Shaolin Temple elixir, guaranteed to supercharge anyone's internal energy. Sign the paper, and the treasure was all his. Without missing a beat, Zeon slapped a parchment contract down demanding his signature. It seemed completely standard, totally free of any binding magical curses. The catch: he would have to act as Zeon's personal attack dog, and if he dared to step out of line, the punishment would be catastrophic. To sweeten the pot, Zeon dangled an even crazier prize, promising a great if the kid coughed up the secrets behind his martial arts techniques. Totally baffled, Sungmin stared right back, asking what kind of idiot would ever agree to sell their soul like that. Zeon's expression went ice cold as he stated it was the ultimate price of admission for any mercenary hoping to survive in Behengar. Leaning in with burning curiosity, Lud practically begged to know how his partner handled the pressure. Sungmin scoffed, saying he told the boss to shove it. He wasn't about to sign up for fancy indentured servitude. Realizing they just kicked a hornet's nest, Lud urged him to pack his bags and flee Behengar immediately. One wrong move, and he could wind up in a ditch, since Zeon was notorious for pulling incredibly dirty tricks behind closed doors. Even if Sungmin kept his head down, the vindictive captain had the power to make his daily life an absolute living nightmare. Lud revealed he once turned down a similar A-rank contract, and overnight he was completely blacklisted because Flair held a brutal monopoly over the city's job boards. He had to grind his way to S-rank in a completely different city just to show his face again, only to find out Zeon had scaled the ranks right alongside him. While Sungmin fell into a deep troubled silence, Lud just kept tossing back his drinks. He felt completely betrayed, realizing his childhood idol was actually a shattering years of blind admiration. Breaking the tension, Lud pitched a new idea, asking if they should escape to Mythor together. But right before he could answer, a loud voice boomed across the tavern, screaming that the Dark Mage's hidden dungeon had finally been uncovered. And the whispers confirmed that this was the exact same lunatic who engineered the terrifying Chimera. The strike team was finally assembling, with Flair spearheading this massive dungeon raid. A hushed voice muttered that the preparations had dragged on way longer than anticipated. Regardless, our hero desperately needed a blade right this second. Without hesitation, she slid it into his hands. Forged mostly from pure mithril, a dark iron shell coated the blade, making it an absolute powerhouse for channeling raw mana. The kid just stared at the masterpiece, completely. Neville chimed in, noting that Lady Selgerus definitely had a soft spot for him, especially since those crafting materials cost an absolute fortune. Vega had tossed in extra coin to upgrade the gear, yet the elven smith kept almost nothing for her own labor. But Neville totally got it. Our guy possessed this bizarre, magnetic aura that just forced people to have his back. Catching the kid's weirded out expression, Neville quickly backpedaled and apologized. He slipped away, tossing back a reminder to call if he ever needed a hand. Now flying solo, the young warrior spiraled into his own mind. He wasn't freaked out because the theory sounded crazy. He was rattled because it perfectly validated the creeping suspicion he already harbored. The first red flag popped up back at Mount Mush. At the time, he just brushed it off as dumb luck. But if some unseen force was actually twisting people's minds to favor him, did that mean every friendship, every memory was a total lie? Deep in this mental spiral, Luda casually strolled up, immediately spotting the grim shadow hanging over Sungmin's face. If the paranoia held weight, even their tight bond could be a complete illusion. Luda threw a friendly arm around him, asking if the upcoming death trap had him sweating. Right then it clicked. His creeping dread had actually taken root the second he slaughtered that chimera ogre and fractured the timeline. That single kill forced the guild to hunt down the Dark Mage, uncovering this hellhole a full 3 months ahead of his previous life's schedule. And that wasn't the only ripple effect. Zion. The guy actually looked thrilled to see the rising star tagging along for the bloodbath. Catching sight of the kid, Zion smirked, bragging that this run would be a total cakewalk. In the original timeline, Flair missed this raid completely because they were locked into a different contract. Now they were front and center, all thanks to that 3-month timeline shift. Zion's gaze shifted, catching Luda standing right there. Flashing a chilling smile, he warned them both to watch their backs. This place was a meat grinder, and death could snatch anyone in the blink of an eye. With the final commands echoing, the vanguard marched forward in a tight single-file line. Luda instantly picked up on the venom laced in Zion's warning. The bastard could easily slit their throats in the mayhem and chalk it up to a tragic accident. For a split second, our hero debated ditching the entire operation right then and there. But the secret skills buried deep inside were just too priceless to walk away from. So he plunged in. 3 agonizing months had passed since he descended the mountain, yet his power had completely stagnated. To shatter this bottleneck, he desperately needed the magical armor Devnark. It was a legendary artifact, capable of boosting a trash-tier fighter straight into the master ranks. Snapping back to their hushed conversation, Luda whispered that Zion wouldn't dare pull anything stupid with this massive crowd watching. The strike force boasted 27 heavy hitters in total, 1 SS rank 4 S ranks, and 12 A ranks. Alongside Flair's elite muscle, even Baron, the guildmaster himself, had stepped onto the battlefield. Gripping his spiritual blade, Luda swore. He'd carve through absolutely anyone who tried to pull a fast one. Luda had zero business being in this death trap, meaning he only tagged along out of pure concern for his best friend. Lee Sung-min felt a heavy wave of gratitude, even though it meant dragging Luda right into Zion's crosshairs. Suddenly a crucial detail flashed in his mind. Shaking off the mental fog, he braced for action. Up front, the commander roared that the Beholder mercenaries are officially breaching the Black Sea dungeon. They had zero clue what nightmares lurked in the shadows, but they knew damn well they were the deadliest fighters in Beholder. He ordered them to lock it down and brace for absolute chaos. With a final initially, the cavern was dead silent. The heavy hitters advanced shoulder to shoulder into the gloom. Taking point was the A-rank bruiser, Jumchul. As a master of external martial arts, the guy's flesh was literally as tough as granite. But in a single blinding flash, his torso was cleaved clean in two. The fighters right behind him just froze, completely paralyzed by the shock. Jumchul hadn't even processed the strike. His massive frame separated, leaving a horrified comrade clutching nothing but his severed upper torso. The commander exploded in rage, but as his eyes darted around the cavern locking onto a swarm of advancing horrors, he realized they were in for a very long night. The moment the squad recognized the beasts as mutated chimeras, sheer panic. Zion instantly clocked the escalating disaster. This raid was already turning into an absolute massacre. These freaks were unnaturally massive and horrifyingly mutated, amplifying their raw power to terrifying heights. Unfazed Zion obliterated one of the beasts with a single brutal strike. Watching closely from the backline, our hero recognized the flawless mystic footwork and devastating fist techniques. Analyzing, he knew deep down he lacked the raw power to take him on. Trapped in his own head, he completely missed the massive chimera, lunging straight for his blind spot. Back in his past life, this entire zone was a dead, empty wasteland, which meant the dungeon master himself was likely lurking in the shadows right now. Gasping for air and dripping blood, our hero sensed a chilling shift. The slaughter just kept going, leaving a mountain of fresh corpses in its wake. Zion scanned the brutal casualties, realizing real fast that clearing this hellhole might actually be an impossible pipe dream. Even so, he smirked and trash-talked the commander, bragging about his crew's superior firepower. Meanwhile, Luda caught a dark detail amidst the bloodbath. Zion shielded absolutely. Barely 1 hour into the breach, the strike force had already buried 2 elite A-rank mercenaries. Out of the battered survivors left standing, the absolute only solo A-rank hunter outside the Flare Guild was Tang Musuk. Luda gently gave his name to the trembling girl, promising her she was completely safe now. But when his presence only made her shrink back in pure terror, he just sighed and stepped back over to Sunvin. Right at that exact second, a voice echoed out shouting for the guildmaster. A scout delivered the grim news. The vanguard was basically torn to shreds. Taking it in, the boss steadied his voice. He offered a cold apology, declaring there was absolutely no turning back. The heavy hitters were still breathing, specifically the S-rank and double S-rank powerhouses, meaning violently charging forward. Catching the sheer panic in the girl's eyes, he flatly offered her an out. She could run back if she wanted. But he made it crystal clear out there. Absolutely nobody would be watching her back. Staring at the mangled corpses littering the floor, her anxiety spiked into pure, suffocating dread. Swallowing her fear, she realized clinging to the pack was her only real shot at surviving. Inch by inch, the battered crew pushed forward, eyes darting at every single shadow. The entire zone fell dead silent. Whispers broke out among the ranks. Maybe the monster swarms were just cheap bait to buy the dungeon boss enough time to slip away. Throwing chimeras into the meat grinder to stall for time, totally tracked. But nobody was foolish enough to drop their guard over a blind theory. Suddenly, a scout pointed through the gloom. Looming right ahead was a massive, tightly sealed gateway. No tripwires, no ominous glow, just plain wood. Yet our guy's gut screamed that something was off. Pushing it open, they uncovered a massive, dust-choked library. Flickering candle in hand, a hunter shrugged it off, muttering that it was just a bunch of useless, rotting books. With so much ground to cover, The boss ordered the crew to scatter and hunt for hidden triggers. But the exact second Sunvin crossed that threshold, a bizarre chill crawled up his spine. He instantly recognized it. This was the exact spot where that guy had unearthed the legendary enchanted gear that flipped his entire destiny. Lurking in the shadows, Sunvin remembered the story how the man had wandered the caverns for hours before stumbling upon a hidden entrance. Crossing that threshold, he had faced a colossal archive, the very same one surrounding Sunvin right now. The clock was ticking to track down the exact tome that unlocked. After intensely scanning the dusty racks, a heavy stone panel suddenly gave way right before his eyes. A pitch-black stairwell spiraled. He knew with absolute certainty the mystical Devnark armor was waiting in the depths. But Zion's sharp eyes immediately caught the kid cracking the secret vault. Zion clapped slowly, throwing fake praise that made the kid's blood run cold. Whipping around, our hero nervously stammered that he just tripped over a lucky switch. Flashing a twisted grin, the captain whispered that he had a real soft spot for clever rats like him. That chilling response left Sunvin completely paralyzed. Out of nowhere, a brutal fist buried itself deep into his gut. The raw impact sent our guy violently crashing down the jagged steps. Zion's logic was stone cold. If the brat refused to kneel, he had to be erased. His raw potential was a ticking time bomb. With Baron isolated in a different wing, with the elite guards, suddenly Luta's silhouette cut through the gloom at the top of the landing, proving he hadn't abandoned the fight just yet. He had cleanly unleashed his phantom blade art, silently dropped. He knew deep down that this two-faced snake had been biding his time, waiting for the perfect shadow to drop his heroic mask. And Luta was painfully aware his own head was next on the chopping block. A split second later, he watched his buddy get ruthlessly hurled into the pitch-black abyss. Zion scoffed, genuinely amused that these two street rats actually thought they stood a chance. Our hero did the brutal math in his head. The odds were absolute garbage, especially if even staring at death throwing in the towel wasn't an option. He fiercely yanked his buddy off the floor and bolted into the darkness. Head spinning from the chaos, he just barked that they needed to hit rock bottom right now. Securing the Devnark gear, a legendary artifact that massively supercharges its host, was their sole ticket out of this slaughterhouse. Lungs burning, the duo crashed into the lowest cavern. Our guy frantically scanned the gloom until his eyes locked onto it, the gleaming chest plate sitting dead ahead. While Luta planted his feet to lock down the narrow choke point, he sprinted desperately toward the priceless relic. But panic flashed in Luta's eyes as a terrifying blur closed the distance. Zion launched a devastating strike, burying his fist directly into Luta's ribcage. The bloody arm punched clean out the boy's back. Our hero's entire world just froze in pure horror. With a sick squelch, Zion ripped his dripping arm free, letting the lifeless. With his fading breath, Luta forced out one last death. Utterly shattered, our guy couldn't even mentally digest the bloody nightmare unfolding right in front of him. A rush of his greatest memories with his best friend flooded his mind, sharply contrasting the mangled corpse now bleeding out at his boots. In a split second, but the monster wearing Zion's face couldn't care less. Coming up from the dirt with zero innate class, trust was a fatal luxury in this world. Even the lowest scum wouldn't hesitate to slide a blade between your ribs. Cornered, the kid lashed out with a desperate spinning kick. Zion's patience had completely evaporated. He just wanted to see this brat's corpse. The brutal impact sent the kid skidding wildly across the dirt, slamming hard, and amazingly, the kid's massive blade had absorbed the brunt of Zion's crushing strikes without shattering. Driving a merciless fist squarely into the boy's jaw, Zion barked at him to surrender the oversized sword. Ripping the hilt from the kid's weakened grip, he instantly noticed the weapon felt weightless, defying its massive size. Narrowing his eyes, he realized the entire thing was forged from pure mithril. Suddenly, an eerie, chill metallic fragments of ancient armor began snapping onto our hero's battered frame. Devnar had finally acknowledged him, and raw, surging power started flooding back into his veins. Zion's eyes widened. This wasn't just metal. It was sentient, magical plating. The kid stood up, radiating an incredibly intimidating aura. A deep sense of dread washed over Zion, as suffocating pitch-black energy making it impossible to gauge his true power level. Gritting his teeth, Zion hung back, hunting for the perfect opening. In seconds, the midnight black armor had entirely encased the young warrior. A heavy silence fell over the battlefield as the two locked eyes in a lethal until a deafening blast absolutely shattered the quiet. Completely baffled as to what that sinister aura was and why it had just evaporated into thin air, Zion lunged forward with a ferocious right hook, roaring at the kid to fight back. The young hero was just as bewildered, feeling absolutely zero shift in his physical limits or mana core. Despite the letdown, Zion sneered, giving the kid twisted credit for surviving his relentless assault, but promised his next breath would be his last. Glancing over at his brutally injured comrade, our protagonist realized they were totally out of options. Zion's massive lethal hand extended ready to deliver the killing. Out of nowhere, a massive spectral entity materialized, effortlessly deflecting the fatal strike. Unlocking Devnar's true form carried an agonizing... That terrifying pact with the ancient entity wasn't even finalized yet. As Zion recklessly charged at the towering spirit, his muscles instantly seized up, overwhelming him with every battle-hardened instinct screaming in the kid's brain, warned him to absolutely avoid crossing blades with that monstrosity. Suddenly, throwing the surviving mercenaries into an absolute panic. The squad captain frantically demanded to know if the infamous dark mage had arrived, but the masked figure remained dead silent, slowly raising a few trembling fingers. The captain's blood ran completely cold. It wasn't a mage, it was a waking lich. Panic erupted as one mercenary screamed at the top of his lungs, but the ancient horror moved with blinding supernatural speed. With a casual flick of its skeletal wrist, it instantly obliterated Baron. As the frantic survivors scrambled for the exit, they crashed into a massive, impenetrable barrier. The terrifying entity's voice echoed in their minds, mocking them. They were merely rats. The monstrosity was actually practically giddy, having stumbled upon a sacrificial pawn, vastly superior to its previous Chimera Ogre experiment. Gliding menacingly through the shadows, it rambled about its twisted destiny. Claiming salvation for its followers was still agonizingly out of reach. This was the legendary nightmare Lich Preskin. The ensuing massacre was over in a heartbeat. The undead sorcerer relentlessly butchered the entire raiding party, effortlessly wiping out dozens of elite S-rank mercenaries. Baron, a highly revered spellcaster, was violently torn clean in two, while the seemingly unstoppable Zion was swatted down like a pathetic insect. Paralyzed by the carnage, our hero internally spiraled, desperately trying to comprehend this absolute nightmare. He truly thought his second chance at life would rewrite his tragic fate. He had sworn to evolve into an apex predator, completely refusing to die as a pathetic insect trapped in the dirt. His heart shattered as his sorrowful gaze locked onto his fallen comrade. A sickening realization crashed over him. He hadn't changed at all. He was still entirely powerless. The skeletal abomination hovered. Cut to the pitch-black dungeon where our hero hung suspended heavy iron chains, pinning him to the damp stone. Preskin cheerfully welcomed its new toy to the laboratory, lazily warning, thrashing against those unbreakable magical restraints. A bone-chilling raspy giggle slipped from the monster's teeth as it enjoyed the kid's desperate squirming. Out of nowhere, the abomination dropped an absolutely bizarre confession. In its twisted mind, females possessed a divine, awe-inspiring power that the greatest alchemists could never replicate. Driven by this manic obsession, Preskin had exhausted every unspeakable taboo to alter its gender, only to plunge hopelessly into the abyss of dark sorcery and permanently sacrifice its mortal flesh and humanity for eternal, rotting existence. But finally, it genuinely believed it had cracked the ultimate code. Even without a functioning wound, there was a far more sinister method to forge entirely new life from scratch. The sheer insanity of those words left the young warrior completely paralyzed with shock. For the being it had encountered so long ago, cursed with incredibly tangled karma, had fully mutated into a beast. If it could harness a vessel like this young fighter, someone harboring such a delightfully warped destiny, it could finally jumpstart its grotesque masterpiece. Gripping the kid's jaw with its icy skeletal fingers, it gleefully whispered its horrific grand design. Absolute terror gripped the hero. His mind raced, but every exit was totally slammed shut. He could only stare in wide-eyed horror as the giggling undead mastermind began orchestrating the... Suddenly the boy began hyperventilating, his chest heaving violently. Pumping its max magical output into the spell, the lich hit a massive, inexplicable roadblock. Utterly baffled by the disruption, the monster's glowing eye sockets flickered. According to all its centuries of research, this absolute failure defied the laws of magic. Dropping the kid's face, the creature spun around, spiraling into frantic, obsessive calculation. While the lich paced, our hero gasped, and then the horrifying truth hit the monster. The demonic entity had snapping back, the lich violently clamped its bony hand around the boy's throat, dragging him uncomfortably close. Burning with manic curiosity, it demanded to know, had flat out refused him. A mortal stained with such deeply cursed karma should have been an unimaginably priceless feast. Losing its mind, the furious sorcerer resolved to rip into the kid's mind, to violently pry loose his darkest hidden truths. Rattled to its rotting core, the monster roared, hell-bent on seeing every single one of his As the young warrior snapped awake, the lich had vanished into thin air. A heavy sigh escaped Lee Sung-min's lips. He had somehow cheated death. However, that fleeting comfort shattered the moment he took in his surroundings. Swallowed. Even then, a relentless buzzing echoed in his skull. The gruesome memories of the recent slaughter replayed on an endless loop, keeping his heart hammering against his ribs. Lude's dying expression flashed before his eyes, accompanied by that haunting cicada shriek that had completely faded after the terrifying chimera retreated. Shaking off the dread, he forced his battered limbs to move. It was not raw talent driving him, but the gritty, unbreakable willpower forged during— Back then, he had sworn a blood oath to his comrades, and he absolutely refused to bite the dust in this damp tomb. Tears of thick crimson streamed down his face as he muttered those sacred vows, pushing his broken body forward. This bitter taste of regret was an old familiar friend. Wallowing in pathetic self-pity, could wait until he saw daylight again. Suddenly, a sharp, uninvited voice pierced his mind through a telepathic link. It was Lloyd, the legendary master of the Golden Mage Tower, desperately pleading for a lifeline. His weak voice echoed from the crushing depths far beneath the young warrior's feet. Recalling how the great sorcerer had mysteriously vanished in his previous timeline, Sungmin cautiously listened as the trapped man begged for a rescue. The Grand Master was severely wounded, paralyzed in the rubble, and frantically crying out for extraction. When questioned about the undead monstrosity, Sungmin bluntly revealed the Lich had already fled the scene. Despite the plea, the young mercenary kept his guard up, his instincts screaming that this hidden abyss was practically a death trap. Staking his very mana core on a solemn oath, Lloyd swore to grant unimaginable riches for his salvation. Lured by the promise, the boy— Minutes dragged on until he finally breached the designated chamber. The battered mage exhaled a shaky breath of pure relief. His eyes locked desperately onto the scorched, shattered ruins, painted the picture of an apocalyptic clash. Then a chilling detail caught the boy's eye. Glancing down, he spotted Zion's lifeless corpse, sporting a gaping, bloody crater straight through his chest. He demanded to know what the hell went down. Brushing off the interrogation, Lloyd barked that story time could wait, and frantically urged the boy to pull him out. Refusing to inch a single step closer, the cautious mercenary asked what his exact job was. The desperate caster ordered him to haul his paralyzed body out of this godforsaken— With a trembling index finger, the Grandmaster pointed toward the shadowy left corner, frantically begging him to smash a specific object. It was a grotesque, radiating a lethal aura. That foul organ needed to be obliterated immediately. Wasting zero time, the young warrior lunged forward, thrusting— Crack! A violent, unseen barrier deflected his blade. As he forced his way forward, the sinister organ violently morphed, unleashing a terrifying wave of— In the blink of an eye, the phantom organ blurred, attempting to vanish into thin air. Completely blindsided by the trick, the dumbfounded warrior stood frozen in his tracks. A split second later, a freezing agony struck the wretched artifact, had fused straight into his own chest. He had unwittingly absorbed the dreaded black heart. Rewinding the clock a few hours reveals exactly how— As Preskin prepared his grand escape, the monstrous lich suddenly staggered violently. He had recklessly unleashed a taboo, mind-warping hex. However, the dark ritual blew up in his face. Even the almighty demon king of fear spat the boy out, outright, rejecting the kid's soul as a worthy sacrifice. A cold wave of panic hit the undead sorcerer. Glaring at the two unnatural hearts resting before him, his twisted mind hatched a backup scheme. He would simply devour the life force of the unconscious grunts littering the— But Zion was miraculously still breathing. Meanwhile, snatching a different fallen soldier by the throat, the lich mercilessly siphoned his essence to replenish his dark core. After sucking two of those grunts entirely dry, the vile undead finally felt his magic stabilize. Pivoting his hollow gaze toward the third captive sprawled in the dirt, he immediately— That man was Zion, completely drenched in a freezing sweat, his entire frame trembling at the gruesome fate awaiting him. Defying all logic, the captive forcefully shattered the magical restraint. Intrigued by this premium, high-tier soul, the undead mastermind decided against a quick snack, and plotted a far more wicked use for the resilient. Cutting through the tension, Lloyd demanded to know what twisted endgame Preskin was plotting. The Grandmaster was sickened to realize this skeletal freak was still running his deranged taboo experiments after a whole decade. The legendary caster had finally cornered his elusive prey. He was the relentless bloodhound who had chased this necromancer down without a single pause. Sensing the undead's magical exhaustion, Lloyd resolved to obliterate his physical vessel right then and there. Zion instantly recognized the imposing figure as the supreme archmage of the Golden Tower. Fired up, the captive eagerly offered his blade to help slaughter the lich. Shutting him down instantly, Lloyd bluntly stated the kid was dead weight and ordered him to stay back. Backed into a corner by the archmage's arrival, and the rejected sacrifice panic gripped the lich. His flawless master plan was circling the drain. Desperation sparked a mad idea as he stared at the two artificial hearts. They were flawed, but a cornered rat had no other option. He furiously chanted an ancient incantation. Warning bells rang in Lloyd's head as he failed to decipher the alien, chaotic surge of dark energy flooding the chamber. This grotesque anomaly was the crowning unholy achievement of Preskin's death. A bone-chilling grin stretched across the Lich's skull as he heralded the birth of the ultimate life form. A vicious explosion rocked the underground cavern, and through the clearing smoke, a pale Lloyd's jaw dropped in sheer horror as the necromancer successfully manifested a humanoid woman. Her flesh and internal core were dangerously unstable, but the madman, his twisted scheme was to use this half-baked weapon as a meat shield to survive the clash, plotting to perfect the secondary core once he escaped. Realizing any holding back would mean certain death, Lloyd resolved to vaporize the abomination completely. He unleashed a devastating apocalyptic spell that threatened to blast. Spitting dark commands, the Lich sicked his newborn weapon on the arrogant archmage, buying himself precious seconds. Biding her time, the girl watches for the perfect strike. Lloyd's high-tier spells bounce off her like harmless raindrops. Shock ripples through the group as his ultimate magic dissolves into thin air. The Lich grins ear to ear, thrilled by her flawless execution. Whispering "Daddy," she whines about being hungry, her cold gaze locking onto Lude. In one swift, brutal motion, she plunges her hand into his chest and rips out his heart. Just like that, the legendary captain of the behemoth mercenaries, destined to become the master of snuffed out before he could even draw a breath. What unfolded next was pure, unadulterated chaos. Staring down her monstrous strength, panic grips Lloyd. All the while, the Lich cackles like a maniac at the massacre he orchestrated. That abomination was capable of absolute destruction. The bloodbath dragged on, with Lloyd burning through every last drop of his mana to blast the girl away. In the end, the badly battered duo managed a desperate. That was the grim reality of the cave incident. Now breathing safe air, Lloyd pours his gratitude onto the boy for saving his neck. He is especially thankful the kid shattered that cursed heart. After sounding the alarm, Lloyd had blacked out, missing the aftermath entirely. Yet the boy is still wrestling with whatever bizarre energy invaded his body. Lloyd bows his head again, swearing to reward him handsomely for his coming from a grand mage. It was essentially a blank check. But the kid did not need anything right now, choosing to pocket that massive favor for later. What Lloyd remained oblivious to was the truth about the heart. Perskan, the infamous overlord of the Black Magic Tower, had a bounty on his head for crossing the ultimate line. And the man tasked with hunting him down was none other than Lloyd, the master of the Golden Magic Tower. 10 grueling years of tracking finally culminated in that catastrophic raid. In his previous timeline, however, because the boy's regression altered fate, the one destined to die had survived, but at the cost of someone who was a suffocating guilt over the death of Lude weighs him down. He used to be a frog at the bottom of a well, worshipping Lude as the invincible peak of humanity. Sure, they had butchered their fair share of monsters, thinking they ruled the world. But their world was nothing more than a tiny patch of sky seen from a hole in the ground. Out there, terrifying predators roamed under an infinitely vast horizon. It makes him question just how monstrously powerful Weiji Hoyan actually is. Standing on Mush Mountain, he had tasted true insignificance. He was just a bug in the dirt. But he refuses to let despair swallow him, resolving to grind forward, inch by painful inch. Breaking his train of thought, a breezy voice echoes from behind. Kim Jong-hyun points out the horrific death toll of the raid team, expressing genuine relief that the kid walked out alive. His sharp eyes then lock onto the armor, immediately recognizing it. Dripping with curiosity, he begs for a closer look. The boy agrees, hoping the eccentric mage might have some answers of his own. This isn't just gear, it is a forced pact item, forged to chain the soul of the wearer to an otherworldly transcendent. Like a demon king or dark god, it completely overrides consent, shackling the host in a master-slave dynamic. Sketching a quick diagram, the mage breaks down how it explosively amplifies a warrior's raw potential. The catch: the second you die, your soul becomes the eternal property of a demon lord. But since the kid wore it and walked away completely unchanged, this was a massive anomaly. The mage rubs his chin, laying out two wild theories. Option 1. The boy was completely empty, lacking even the baseline potential to be exploited. Option 2. His soul was already claimed by an entity infinitely more terrifying than the mage bets his money on the second theory, which leaves the kid scratching his head. Why exactly did the Demon King of Fear spit him out? Since the twisted contract lies dormant, the armor is perfectly safe to use. Like this. With a casual snap of his fingers, he strips the heavy plating off the boy, shrinking it down into a sleek bracelet. Just channel a little mana, he says, and boom, instant. Catching his breath, the boy drops another bombshell. The Lich had The mage says it is an absolute miracle the kid kept his sanity after facing such an eldritch horror. Flashing a knowing grin, he asks if the boy grasps the weight of that survival. The kid wonders out loud if his soul outranks the Demon King of Fear, But the mage just shrugs, unable to confirm. Suddenly the puzzle pieces snap together. The kid brings up that his body absorbed something strange, and the mage instantly pins it down as a dark heart. Even so, the boy flexes his aura, confused, because he feels absolutely zero changes inside. Pre-Scan had dedicated his twisted life to engineering the ultimate life form, and that heart was his magnum opus, something leagues above demonic armor. Bowing slightly in apology for his limited knowledge, the mage suggests that only a divine being could unravel this mystery. That sparks a memory. Musha's fading words echo in his mind. Head to Draymore and seek out Denir, the king of time. A literal god of time might finally give him the answers he craves. Offering a quick thanks, he turns to leave. The mage tosses out a chilling farewell, claiming he has grown quite fond of the kid and welcoming him back any time. A cold sweat drips down the neck of the boy as he catches the heavy, dangerous undertone. He steps out and swiftly pulls the door shut. He grabbed some solid clues today, but the mountain of questions only grew taller. Next stop, Draymore. Suddenly, footsteps thunder down the corridor, screaming out for Lee Sung-min. Before he can react, Scarlet launches a flying kick straight into his neck, barking that she explicitly told him to steer clear of. Massaging his throbbing neck, he just stares at her, wondering why every single reunion has to start with extreme violence. Scarlet snaps, warning him that nothing good ever comes from crossing paths with that creep. But our guy brushes it off, claiming he just needed to ask a couple of questions. She steps right up to him, demanding he interrogate her instead. "Spit it out," she challenges. "What are you really after?" His very first question, he straight up asks her age. Her face instantly flushes with absolute rage. You just don't drop a question like that on a lady. Strolling down the path, she points out the insane fact that he actually survived the entire— Despite enduring all that hell, he didn't have a single scratch on him, yet his eyes carried this heavy, crushing sorrow. He breaks the silence, mentioning he is bound for Dremord to tie up some loose ends. Catching that, she immediately volunteers to tag along. She quickly claims she has her own errands in Dremord, flashing a smile and suggesting that hitting the road together just makes perfect sense. Catching his lingering hesitation, she glares and asks if he seriously hates having her around. Truth be told, his mind was just drawing a total blank. It wasn't like he hated the idea. This girl was a literal magical prodigy and the heir to the Crimson Magic Tower. Getting buddy-buddy with a powerhouse like her could be a massive advantage. Yet a dark thought gnawed at him. Why were people suddenly acting so damn nice? In his twisted experience, every single relationship he had ever forged was rooted in pure deception. He couldn't shake the bitter feeling that Lude died for absolutely nothing. Sure, he lacked hard evidence, but his gut screamed that Scarlet's sudden road trip pitch had a hidden agenda. If things went south and she met the exact same tragic fate as his fallen friend, the crushing guilt would absolutely destroy him. That sheer dread is exactly why he wants to ride solo. Cutting back to reality right after rescuing Lloyd and securing the Black Heart, he had thoroughly looted Xion's lifeless body. A paranoid snake like Xion never trusted banks or stash houses. He definitely carried his most precious treasures right in his pockets. And pay dirt. He snagged a lesser revitalization pill, a greater revitalization pill, alongside the legendary secret Shaolin manual of ultimate martial. Each piece of this loot was beyond priceless. Throwing his worries aside, he knew his absolute top priority was leveling up his own power. Without a second thought, he tosses one of the miraculous— Sitting cross-legged on his bed, he slips into deep meditation, waiting for the surge. But the moment he hops back to his feet, absolute silence. Under normal circumstances, a top-tier elixir like the lesser revitalization pill would ignite a blazing firestorm of internal energy the second it hit your stomach. With zero reaction, he almost curses himself, assuming he swallowed a total dud. Suddenly, an intense, blinding warmth starts. A wild inferno erupts inside him. Long story short, the elixir was 100% authentic, and his internal energy skyrocketed off the charts. Typically, an elixir's raw power violently explodes, forcing the user to desperately wrestle and channel that chaotic flow through their veins. But our guy, he effortlessly soaked up every single drop of that lesser pill's monstrous power without lifting a finger. It was terrifyingly simple. The wild aura instantly submitted to him. The only logical explanation, that mysterious dark heart beating inside his chest, was doing the heavy lifting. Shifting his gaze to the ornate little box, he snatches up the greater revitalization pill. In a heartbeat, he flawlessly devours the combined essence of both legendary drugs. Measuring his raw, surging chi, he was suddenly brushing shoulders with Supreme Peak Masters. Again, that dark, ominous heart was the ultimate cheat code. He didn't need a stat screen to feel it. That crippling lack of internal energy that had chained him down his whole life was permanently shattered. Still, raw power meant nothing if he didn't wield it right. A crazy, brilliant spark lights up his eyes. Fast forward. Scarlet furiously demands to know why he abruptly changed their destination to Braden instead of. He plainly states they won't be riding together anymore, offering a quick, half-hearted apology. Flashing the forbidden Shaolin combat scroll he looted, he reveals his grand scheme to personally return it to Braden. Scarlet scoffs looking at this naive kid, and mocks that every street vendor in the market peddles cheap knockoff martial arts manuals. He calmly counters, explaining his actual master plan: march right up to the Shaolin temple, hand over their lost. Since all her supposed urgent tasks were strictly tied to Dremord, their paths were practically forced to split right here. But in a split second, her expression does a total 180, and she smoothly lies, claiming she suddenly has errands. In reality, she just desperately craved the thrill of traveling the world. She waves off city life, boldly declaring she'd much rather toughen up in the wild mountains. Her ultimate dream: roam the earth for a bit, then kick back and settle down in some beautiful, peaceful sanctuary. Clearly annoyed by his stubbornness, she huffs, announcing she is going to grab a hot bath, and then forcibly tag along. Just like that, against all odds, the crazy duo is a. She literally grabs his face, forcing his head to nod up and down, joyfully, cheering that he totally just said yes. Taking a few they lock in their departure date for exactly 1 week later, and he mentally forces himself to look at the bright side of this mess. Having her around meant decent conversation and a drastically safer journey. But suddenly, out of the shadows, a creepy, unfamiliar girl steps right up and demands his name. Shrouded in the dead of night, our duo freezes in their tracks, their eyes locked intensely on this bizarre intruder. Total confusion washes over them as the tension rapidly spikes. Right before their eyes, the girl's body violently mutates. She mutters that crossing paths with him sparked something weird inside her. As her delicate hands wildly snap and contort into massive. Flashing back to the dense forest, Billix was busy marveling at Lloyd's terrifying strength, realizing the guy was the exact kind of monster prodigy the legends whispered about. If Billix hadn't hit the panic button and awakened the girl at the absolute last second, he'd be rotting in the dirt right now. She was supposed to be his ultimate, flawless masterpiece, yet the monstrous girl was giving her. Panic gripping his throat, Billix screams her name as he watches her go rogue. Because he was forced to hatch her way too early, the leash snapped. His control over the beast was completely gone, and his only safety net was that glowing obedience seal, the one leash keeping this monster from tearing him apart. Wiping the cold sweat from his face, he commands her to return to her awakening site and retrieve the lich's heart. Without it, she wouldn't survive. It was supposed to be a simple, grab-and-go mission. Catching a nod of understanding, he points her straight toward the objective. But she immediately sprints in the exact opposite direction. The lich just stands there, completely baffled, wondering if his own creation has a broken compass. Ignoring her master's strict orders, she was drawn toward a bizarre, pulsating energy radiating from the woods. Her pulse hammered in her chest for some unknown reason, finally stopping when two figures came into view. Down the path, Sungmin whips around, instantly suffocated by a spine-chilling aura closing in on them. Step by heavy step, the eerie girl locks onto the stranger, her eyes wide with twisted curiosity. The young warrior tenses up, feeling a sickening dread wash over him the second he sees her face. Right before his eyes, her fingers mutate into grotesque, writhing appendages. Lee Sungmin catches a glint of manic desperation in her stare, right as her entire torso violently bulges outward. Scarlet glares at her partner, wondering why he's frozen like a deer in headlights. Chanting rapidly, she hurls a blazing projectile at the freakish intruder. The blast obliterates the fleshy tendrils, erupting from the creature's arm. Meanwhile, our hero clutches his chest in agony, realizing he desperately needs to catch his breath. Scarlet squints through the smoke, utterly bewildered. She'd never witnessed an abomination like this. It hit her, this had to be Preskin's chimera, the exact nightmare Lloyd warned them about. She was probably hunting for the heart. This was the same beast that slaughtered Zion in the blink of an eye, and even pushed the legendary mage Lloyd to the brink of death. Out of options, he triggers his mystic bracelet. Protecting Scarlet and himself meant going all out with his magical armor. A blinding shockwave erupts as the heavy plating materializes over his flesh. But the mutant girl is already winding up for round 2. Pitch-black vines whip through the air as she charges. Gripping his weapon tight, he tracks her erratic movements and pivots to intercept. He launches himself forward, desperate to shut down her range advantage. He throws everything he has into wild, slashing arcs, hunting for a weak spot. But her combat rhythm is pure chaos, and every strike packs more kinetic force than a mutant ogre. If that rare elixir hadn't supercharged his core energy, his bones would already be dust. From the backline, Scarlet screams at Sungmin to clear the blast zone. Tumbling backward, the fiery mage unleashes an inferno. The mutant tries to sidestep the heat, but the roaring flames engulf her. forcing out a horrific screech of agony. Scarlet clicks her tongue, realizing this freakish child boasts an insane level of magic Normal spells would bounce right off, but Scarlet's destructive output plays by different rules. Standard defenses are useless against her custom, heavily enchanted secret arts. Yet the mage completely fails to notice a vicious counterattack, soaring straight for her face. In a split second, our hero dives in front of his partner, tanking the brutal impact as residual fire scorches the earth. Panting hard, he mentally pieces together this nightmare. A grim memory of Zion flashes in his mind. The stance, the sheer power this creature was using, the legendary mystic fists of 100 Step. Lloyd's sickening warning echoed in his head. The beast devoured Zion's heart, absorbing every ounce of his martial arts mastery. Any lingering doubts vanished. He was fighting an apex predator. The crushing spiritual pressure leaves him dizzy, but the bloodthirsty girl doesn't give him an inch to breathe. She lunges again, her relentless barrage, completely shattering his defensive guard. Mid-swing, her eerie voice echoes, demanding she still craves to know his true identity. But as he desperately parries her lethal strikes, his brain is strictly focused on finding an exit strategy. Channeling a fresh surge of mana, Scarlet aggressively taunts the monster to draw her focus. Landing a stinging slap of magic right across the creature's cheek, Scarlet smugly mocks her for squandering her lucky streak. She lays the trash talk on thick, making it obvious how pissed off she is. The Chimera's dead-eyed stare instantly snaps into pure rage. She glances down just as spectral glowing hands burst from the soil, violently clamping around her ankles. Scarlet's binding hex had worked. Seizing the blind spot, the armored warrior dashes in for a lethal headshot. But in a stomach-churning move, the girl literally rips her own legs out of their sockets to escape the snare. He freezes mid-swing, absolutely horrified by the gory display. Leaving her severed limbs behind, she plummets toward the ground. But mid-air, a sickening crunch echoes as flesh and bone rapidly weave back together. In the blink of an eye, she miraculously sprouts a brand new pair of legs. The duo grits their teeth in frustration, realizing this deathmatch is going into overtime. Not only did she regenerate her limbs perfectly, but every single burn mark fades into flawless. Scarlet groans in sheer annoyance, though she calculates that this level of cellular regeneration has to drain a massive amount of mana. If they keep up the tag team assault and constantly shred her body, her magical reserves will eventually hit zero, securing them the win. That theory dies instantly when the monstrosity flexes an even more suffocating aura. Feeling the endless ocean of power radiating off her Scarlet, this nightmare was leagues beyond their worst-case scenario. The brutal brawl rages on. Our hero endlessly deflects devastating blows. As his knees buckle, Scarlet panics, yelling at him not to dare die and leave her stranded in this hell. In that agonizing second, a harsh truth hits him like a freight train. He had defied fate and reshaped the world around him. His brutal training in the mountains had forged him into a hardened warrior, but it still wasn't nearly enough to reach his ultimate ambition. After all, a mere larva is only destined to crawl in the dirt. Taking just one step forward wasn't enough. He needed to take tens of thousands more. Staring at his own hands, he realizes his fatal mistake was settling for a Fleeing those rugged mountains wasn't just about claiming that cursed, demonic armor. The truth, he hit a massive, unbreakable wall, and the sheer scale of it terrified him. So he took the coward's way out, using the armor's dark corruption as a convenient alibi to run away from the grueling grind. But the price of his cowardice was astronomical. It cost him his absolute most loyal companion, leaving him feeling utterly worthless, a pathetic excuse for a warrior who now had absolutely nothing left. Now the bitter truth sinks in. Running was a catastrophic mistake. Gripping his weapon, the familiar, heavy burden of his spear grounds him for the first time in ages. Over the deafening static buzz of the summer cicadas, a single burning desire consumed him. He just wanted to stand firmly by her side. He desperately craved the power to rewrite his own doomed death. Above all else, he viciously rejected the idea of dying here. It was a ridiculously massive dream for a mere insect, yet he completely refused to let his story end in a pool of his own blood. The path forward was brutally steep, but having grasped a terrifying power he was never meant to hold, taking just one agonizing step forward would never cut it. Surging with the crushing weight of his regrets, his blade pulses with overwhelming energy. The exact second he aggressively hungers for more power, his thrust turns lethally precise, violently tearing straight through the monstrous girl's flesh. Planting his feet securely, he forms an impenetrable shield in front of Scarlet. He absolutely swears no harm will come to her. Dripping with irritation, the freakish child snarls, demanding his identity, even as the brutal spear rips deeper into her frame. Scarlet holds her breath, watching closely. With thick crimson staining his battered face, he firmly declares his name, Lee Sung-min. Right on cue, a vicious arrow slams directly into the young assailant. Coughing up dark blood, she spits out her own name, Ain. Keeping his lethal polearm raised high, He refuses to drop his guard for even a second. Crimson cascades from her lips as horrific gashes rapidly multiply across. Knowing she's beaten the monster turns tail and vanishes into the shadows. The relentless bloodbath leaves the seasoned spearman utterly hollowed out. Blinking awake from the pitch-black darkness, he finds himself resting on a soft mattress. Just a few feet away, Scarlet casually flips through a dusty book in total. Breathing a heavy sigh, he mutters that surviving that vicious clash was pure luck. She casually mentions he had been out cold for 3 whole days. She even dragged a local physician over and dumped some premium healing elixirs all over his gruesome. But the moment he effortlessly rolls right out of bed, Scarlet's jaw practically hits the floor. The guy literally had multiple shattered bones. Miraculously knitting those brutal fractures together in a mere 72 hours was physically impossible unless it was the dark work of that ominous black heart. Squinting, Scarlet eyes him like a complete. Leaning in, she harshly interrogates him about what dark secrets he's hoarding. She demands the full story behind that terrifying demonic brat, sensing he knew exactly who she was. Warning him strictly against playing dumb, she aggressively presses for the raw truth. He clamps his mouth completely shut, initially. But once Lee Sung-min spills every gritty detail, the entire picture becomes horrifyingly clear. Scarlet finally pieces together why he was tragically tangled up with that absolute Kim Jong-hyun. Her battle-scarred companion had dragged himself through absolute hellfire, barely surviving with a phenomenally destructive chunk of raw mana buried inside him. Shaking her head, she casually boasts that he is incredibly blessed to have a certified badass like her backing him up. Catching his deadpan stare, she smirks, demanding some massive groveling gratitude. He immediately counters, questioning why she never bolted. That bloodbath was an absolute slaughterhouse, and the psycho kid was solely gunning for his head, so Scarlet could have easily vanished into thin air at any given moment, yet she chose not to abandon him to a gruesome solo death. Rising slowly to her feet, she murmured that abandoning a comrade just isn't in her blood. Pacing gracefully toward the window, her gaze drifts into a distant, haunted. In a hushed voice, she asks if he has ever witnessed the true horrors of a massive battlefield. Breaking the heavy silence, she confesses that way back when she was just a scrawny kid, long before her, even though the exact timeline and ground zero remain a blurry, chaotic nightmare. War, she mutters bitterly, is a ruthless thief that violently strips away absolutely everything. It completely wiped her childhood village off the map, viciously erasing every single soul she. Lee Sung-min hangs on to her every tragic word. The agonizing weight of that loss utterly broke her, forcing her to build massive walls and securely lock away her heart from everyone. Yet watching him get completely torn to shreds triggered something deep inside her, utterly anchoring her to his side. Locking fiery eyes with him, she softly asks if he has his own. A sad, quiet smile tugs at his lips instead of an answer. Breaking the thick tension, she gently reassures him that his missing buddy is definitely still breathing somewhere out there. She boasts that surviving catastrophic wars and endless chaos was practically her superpower, though mostly fueled by insanely dumb. Plus, she didn't even get to unleash her ultimate hidden technique on that little demon. Scarlet clearly sees straight through his lone wolf act, knowing he purely because the sheer terror of losing another comrade completely paralyzes him. But to truly shield those he cares about, playing it safe won't cut it. She orders him to become an unstoppable force, so history never repeats this gruesome nightmare. Offering a weary but genuine grin, he admits he's already painfully aware of that. As the heavy conversation beautifully winds down, a massive weight totally lifts off his chest. Instructing him to get some actual sleep, Scarlet casually struts out, announcing their bold departure for the. Throwing a highly sincere thank you at her retreating back, he sinks incredibly deep into his swirling, chaotic thoughts. Clenching his spear shaft until his knuckles dramatically turn white, he silently vows to absolutely shatter his own limits. His vivid memories violently rewind to the previous night's bloodbath, where an unprecedented godlike shockwave triumphantly erupted outward. Realizing his own boundless potential, he completely shreds any lingering pathetic doubts. Feeling that intoxicating heavy aura aggressively thrumming through his weapon once more, he solidifies his ironclad ambition to ascend to absolute mastery. Staring at the map that they have finally crossed the grand threshold, right into the legendary. Buzzing with excitement, she blurts out that she's never set foot in a Central District metropolis before. She breathes a sigh of relief that they dodged another ambush. Chattering away, she nudges Lee for their first order of business. But he admits he hasn't figured it out yet. She pitches the idea of kicking back and grabbing some grub. Stepping into a bustling tavern, the staff greets them and they slide into a booth. She immediately starts plotting their meal, though Lee is drawing a total blank. Confessing she's clueless about Central District cuisine, she struggles to pick a dish. Suddenly, she scrunches her nose, complaining about some annoying flies buzzing around them. Lee catches two shady guys glaring daggers at them, and whispers to Scarlet, asking if she clocked them too. He points out that the duo has been sizing them up since the second they walked through the door. When she demands to know why, Lee casually blames himself, leaving her completely, utterly baffled. He breaks it down once a fighter hits the supreme tier. They unlock Origin Reversal, completely masking their aura from outsiders. Lee Sung-min has nailed one of the prerequisites to become a supreme martial master, but he's still lacking the rest. It hits Scarlet like a truck. His raw inner chi is leaking, acting as bait for those pathetic flies. Catching wind of her insult, one of the creeps leans in, demanding to know who she's calling an insect. Smirking, he notes her razor-sharp tongue and asks if playing hard to get is part of her appeal. Disgusted, she snaps, asking what kind of garbage he's spouting. The creep chuckles awkwardly, doubling down on his sleazy advances, but she fiercely orders him to zip it. Scarlet aggressively warns him to choke down his food somewhere else, growling that every syllable he mutters just makes her itch to snap his neck. Lee watches the guy's face flush with pure rage at the rejection. Before either of them can blink, the thug violently grips his blade. He snarls, offering her one final chance to swallow her words. She flat out rejects him, branding him a complete moron. Blinded by fury, he lunges forward, swinging his steel, prompting the young woman to shriek for Sung-min to step up. Glancing at the attacker, Lee instantly pegs him as a low-tier first-class fighter. As the blade descends, Lee calmly calculates the cleanest way to dismantle him. Out of nowhere, a brand new figure steps into the fray. The stranger scoffs, marveling at how a guy could be so trashy in a public joint, let alone suicidal enough to charge a vastly superior target. Mid-sentence, the attacker crumples to the floor, out cold. Sung-min squints, realizing a single flicked coin just knocked the lights right out of the guy. The newcomer smoothly apologizes for crashing the party and introduces himself as Namgung Hee-won. Eyes wide, Scarlet gasps, asking if he hails from the legendary family, infamous for breeding absolute monsters in the martial arts world. Lee brushes it off, muttering he had no intention of ending the thug's life anyway. Undeterred, Hee-won casually asks to crash their table. The duo exchanges bewildered glances, totally lost. Sung-min frowns, wondering why all eyes are glued to him, prompting the stranger to demand his age. When Lee reveals he is barely 18, Namgung's jaw practically hits the floor. He cannot fathom a kid teetering on the edge of the peak supreme rank. Praising Lee's freakish talent, he suddenly zeroes in, asking if he is the infamous little celestial demon, Weiji Hoyan. The name hits Lee so hard he violently chokes on his drink. The swordsman defends his guess, swearing that's the only freak of nature, capable of hitting such heights at that age. Wiping his mouth, Lee probes to see if the guy actually knows the little demon. Hee-won chuckles. Of course he does. The kid is an absolute. He elaborates that this entire region only harbors 3 fighters worthy of the celestial demon title. Baek Musin, the brutal berserker Byuk Won-pei, and the pint-sized nightmare Weiji Hoyon. Leaning in, he whispers a wild rumor that this specific demon might actually be a woman. Dropping the smile, he demands to know Lee's true identity. The boy states his name, Lee Sung-min, and Namgung scratches his head, confessing it doesn't ring a single bell. Pushing his luck, Lee fishes for any extra intel on the little celestial demon. But Hee-won shrugs, admitting his well of information has run dry. If Lee wants the juicy details, he will have to hit the streets himself. Out of nowhere, Hee-won challenges Sung-min to a duel, catching the teen completely off guard. Waving his hands, the guy swears he doesn't want bloodshed. His warrior blood simply boils whenever he stumbles across a top-tier powerhouse. Lee accepts on the condition of keeping it friendly, sparking a massive grin on Hee-won's face. However, the swordsman smirks, claiming a plain spar is way too dull, and pitches a bet. When Lee raises an eyebrow, Hee-won casually proposes a low-stakes gamble. The loser has to bow down as the winner's sworn younger brother. Shaking on it, the duo marches straight to the local combat arena, gearing up for an explosive clash. Stepping into the ring, Sung-min humbly mutters that he might end up disappointing his new pal. Hee-won just barks out a laugh, calling him way too modest. Locking eyes with his opponent, Lee shivers as the swordsman's easygoing aura suddenly sharpens into pure menace. The realization hits him. This guy is a total monster, definitely hovering right around the peak supreme tier. They both sink into their combat stances. Kicking things off, Namgung executes a series of bizarre, unpredictable Lee tracks the weird shifts, but refuses to let it shatter his focus. Seizing the initiative, he launches the blindingly fast, shadowless soul flight strike. Opening with the first form, only to gasp in shock as Namgung shreds right through his tricky feint with terrifying speed. The fierce exchange blurs on, and Hee-won fiercely closes the gap with a heavy assault, openly shouting how much of a blast he is having. Suddenly, he unleashes a vicious energy-draining technique, forcing a panicked Lee to tightly brace his defenses. Pushed to the brink, the protagonist activates the first stance of the 9 Supreme Heaven Spear, unleashes a lethal, soul-hunting strike. Right in the heat of the collision, the adversary fluidly redirects his blade, leaving Lee completely stunned. Namgung points out that if Lee had wielded a genuine spear, that devastating assault would have been fatal. He smirks, declaring he won't hold back anymore, and firmly refuses to call a younger kid his big brother. Sungmin brushes it off, noting the wager was totally rigged against him from the start. So along with Scarlet observing from the sidelines, Namgung taunts Lee, asking if he's finally ready to unleash his full power. Knowing true warriors despise the bitter taste of defeat, the brawl escalates as they relentlessly exchange brutal blows. Following a crushing impact, Lee believes he has his target backed into a corner, but the swordsman effortlessly slips away. Lee hates to confess it, but his rival's energy manipulation is on another level. Desperate, Lee channels his inner chi, blasting out a shockwave to create some breathing room. The sheer destructive force of the 9 Supreme Heaven Spear violently explodes outward. A dizzying swarm of afterimages floods the battlefield to shatter his focus. Lee understands that hidden within those phantoms is a single genuine blade, and he must track it down to survive. However, Namgung completely dominates the exchange, pressing a cold steel sword directly against Lee's throat to claim absolute victory. Sungmin surrenders, acutely aware of just how much further he needs to grow. Chuckling warmly, Hee-won praises Lee's fierce performance, assuring him the skill gap between them is surprisingly narrow. He compliments the boy's spearmanship, but critiques his execution of advanced techniques. He guesses Lee simply hasn't had enough life-or-death clashes against Furthermore, he points out that Lee severely lacks finesse when managing his internal aura. Because of this, even minor grazes inflict unnecessary damage. Speaking from brutal experience, Hee-won promises the young warrior can rapidly iron out these weaknesses through sheer combat experience. Now that they are sworn brothers, Namgung insists Lee accompany him on an important journey straight to the legendary Shaolin Temple. Genuinely startled, Lee reveals he was already heading there. Eavesdropping nearby, Scarlet groans about the racket and demands to know if their little scuffle is finally finished. Watching the two guys laughing like old buddies, she crosses her arms, asking what's wrong with their heads, thoroughly annoyed by this sudden bromance. Miles away, an ancient monk, deep in meditation, opens his eyes, whispering that an ominous presence is approaching. The almighty god of chaos is descending upon them. Meanwhile, Namgung Hee-won's trek to the Shaolin Temple carries a hidden purpose. Lee mentions he makes this pilgrimage annually around this exact season, to visit the esteemed master Abbot Bullion. His new companion explains that the successors of the other 3 elite families do the exact same. United, the trio embarks toward the sacred temple grounds. Along the dusty trail, they discuss the immense power of the 4 noble pillars, the Namgung, Jaegol, Moyong, and Tang clans. They note that the current heirs share roughly the same age. Generations ago, their ambitious patriarchs attempted to merge these 4 massive factions into a single unstoppable empire. But when push came to shove, bitter arguments erupted over who would wear the crown. Ultimately, they dumped that massive responsibility onto the shoulders of the next generation. Master Bullion, the revered Shaolin abbot, was appointed as the ultimate judge. He alone holds the authority to crown the supreme leader among the heirs. Upon breaching the temple gates, Hee-won casually greets the waiting crowd, brushing off his tardiness on unexpected side quests. Sweeping his gaze across the courtyard, Lee quickly realizes that every single face here was an absolute legend in his previous life. Suddenly, a sharp-tongued girl from the Tang family demands to know if Lee is the reason Namgung kept them waiting. Hee-won instantly fires back, fiercely questioning her. He proudly presents Lee as his sworn younger brother, a monstrous martial prodigy, standing on the very edge of the supreme martial peak before even turning 20 years old. The girl raises an eyebrow, utterly baffled at how a genius of that caliber would ever associate with Hee-won. It clicks instantly. She realizes Hee-won is using this powerhouse to intimidate the rival successors. Catching the vibe, Lee deadpans, asking if he was just recruited to be a shiny trophy. Hee-won shamelessly confesses the truth. Even so, Lee shrugs it off, admitting that playing the role of a devoted little brother isn't exactly a heavy burden. An impatient Jaegol suddenly interrupts, demanding to know how long they intend to waste time bickering. Ignoring the attitude, Hee-won announces he is heading in to meet Master Bullion. As the heirs stroll away, Scarlet sighs enviously, wishing she had that kind of leverage. She points out that Lee literally lost the duel, yet still managed to walk away. A monk waves them over kindly, offering a freshly prepared meal. Starving, they eagerly hope the legendary temple cuisine hasn't lost its touch. Picking at her bowl, Scarlet whines about the absolute lack of meat. Rolling his eyes, Lee reminds her that they are sitting inside a Buddhist monastery, so obviously meat is strictly forbidden. Chewing thoughtfully, Lee mentally zeroes in on his actual mission. His objective is crystal clear: secure the hidden scroll, and deliver it straight back to Denier. Suddenly, an attendant steps into the dining hall, announcing that the Grand Abbot has specifically requested his presence. Trailing behind, he is totally clueless as to why the Supreme Leader would single him out. Hell, even in his past timeline, the man was a complete mystery to him. He knew absolutely nothing except for one chilling rumor. The world called him the eccentric Buddha. Stepping into the chamber, the ancient monk pierces him with a stare, and abruptly asks, caught entirely off guard, Lee stammers desperately trying to confirm if he is actually speaking and demands to know what that insane title actually means. He presses for answers, but the frail elder slowly shakes his head, refusing to explain. He solemnly warns that uttering the truth would trigger an instant death, or worse, forcibly erase him from the mortal realm. Ascending, burning with morbid curiosity, Lee desperately asks where he can uncover this forbidden truth. But before he can blink, something deeply unnatural occurs, leaving Lee entirely paralyzed by a reality. And if conquering that first trial wasn't intense enough, his next directive drops head straight north. He has exactly 5 years to survive the brutal trek, pushing onward, and waiting in that freezing abyss is a crucial figure destined to alter his entire fate. The second the elderly mentor finally snaps out of his eerie trance, a bewildered Lee frantically yet the master completely dodges the interrogation. Shaking his head, he chillingly insists that the